Somewhere beneath the gray and crumbling skin of the Capital Wasteland, a world still breathes. It breathes in the distant hum of old generators, in the dust that drifts through broken windows, in the soft creak of a pre-war door swinging on a single hinge. Fallout 3 is a place where the smallest things carry weight. A torn letter in a ruined mailbox, a child's toy left on a collapsed shelf, a raider running the bases of a long-dead baseball field while the rest of the world burns around him. These are the kinds of details that do not demand your attention. They simply wait, quiet and patient, until you are ready to find them. Tonight, we are going to wander through those forgotten corners together, drifting softly through the strange and gentle strangeness of the Capital Wasteland. Before you settle in, maybe tap subscribe for more calm stories, and share where in the world you're watching from tonight, beginning now with one of the most quietly overlooked truths hidden inside the opening seconds of the game, a detail so small and so perfectly placed that most players walk right past it without ever realizing what they have left behind. When the lone wanderer steps out of Vault 101 for the very first time, two vault guards give chase. They pursue the player through the curved corridors of the vault with determined energy, shouting and stumbling over each other in the narrow passages. But the moment the player steps through the outer door and crosses the threshold into the open air of the wasteland, those guards stop completely. They freeze at the doorway as if an invisible wall has been placed across the entrance. They will not follow. They cannot follow. This was not an accident. The development team at Bethesda made a deliberate choice to end the pursuit at the vault door. For those vault guards, the outside world was not simply dangerous. It was unthinkable. The rules that governed their existence stopped exactly where the steel door ended, and they had no programming, no courage, no language for anything beyond it. The player steps into sunlight, the guards remain inside, and neither side quite understands the other. It is a small thing. It takes only a few seconds, but it contains an entire philosophy about the world of Fallout 3, where survival is not about moving forward, but about knowing which doors you are able to open and which ones you are not. The Capital Wasteland itself is built on a curious foundation. The game takes place in and around the ruins of Washington, D.C., but the city that Bethesda constructed is not a precise architectural replica. Streets were compressed, landmarks were repositioned, and entire neighborhoods were reimagined to serve the needs of gameplay. Yet the spirit of the city remained. The Washington Monument still rises above the rubble. The Lincoln Memorial still stands beside the reflecting pool. The Capitol building still crowns its familiar hill, wrapped now in scaffolding and the banners of a new and brutal occupant. What is remarkable is how much of that atmosphere survived the translation from the real world to the fictional one. Players who have never visited Washington, D.C. still feel the weight of the place, the sense that something important once happened here, that the ruins around them were not always ruins. The game carries a particular kind of historical sadness that few open-world games have managed to replicate, a mourning for something that existed and was then lost, not just in the fiction of the bombs, but in the deeper human sense of time and impermanence. The Vault Tech letters found in the mailboxes of Springvale carry some of the quietest storytelling in the entire game. The small suburb just outside Vault 101 contains a scattering of pre-war homes, each with a mailbox at the end of a crumbling path, and inside those mailboxes are letters that tell two very different stories about the same moment in time. One family received a rejection. The letter is polite and corporate and completely devastating. It informs the recipient that their family was not selected for inclusion in their preferred Vault Tech facility. It notes that their deposit has been retained. It suggests, with cheerful indifference, that they might consider relocating to areas where vault accommodations are available without a waiting list, and it mentions Oklahoma as one of those possibilities. The letter wishes the family the best of luck in what it calls the uncertain future. There is nothing more to say after that. Another family received an acceptance letter. The Gomez family was congratulated on their inclusion in the Vault 101 community. The letter outlined rules and procedures with bureaucratic thoroughness. It reminded the Gomez family that personal belongings would need to be reviewed before entering. It instructed them to attend an orientation seminar. It mentioned that a Vault Boy bobblehead toy would be given as a commemorative gift upon presentation of the acceptance letter. And then the bombs fell, and the Gomez family carried their letter to the vault, and their son Freddie grew up inside those steel walls, and the family that received the rejection never had anywhere to go. Joel Burgess, the lead-level designer who wrote those letters, later shared that the mention of Oklahoma was partly drawn from real-world research he conducted while working on the game. He had learned that Oklahoma would, in certain strategic analyses, be considered a prime nuclear target due to infrastructure and defense installations located there. He had found it interesting that such an interior, landlocked state would appear on such a list alongside the coastal cities most people imagined. He added it to the letter as an odd piece of quiet geography, a reminder that the bombs did not discriminate by coast or distance, that the uncertain future had found everyone. There is a location in the Capital Wasteland called Fordham Flash Memorial Field. It is easy to miss. There is nothing particularly dramatic about it at first glance, nothing that calls out for attention with the urgency of other locations. But if a player arrives quietly, without triggering the awareness of the raiders who patrol the area, something unusual becomes visible. One of those raiders is playing baseball, not pretending, not standing near the field, actually running the bases, looping from one marker to the next in a repeated animation that continues for as long as no one disturbs it. The rest of the raider group is out on patrol. This particular individual has simply decided, in the broken logic of a post-apocalyptic afternoon, that it is time for baseball. The detail is funny. It is also a little tender. Somewhere in the behavioral programming of that character, someone thought it would be worth it to write an idle animation for someone playing a game that the world had largely forgotten. The bats still exist. The bases still exist. The field is still a field, even if the grass is long gone and the stands have collapsed into themselves. And one raider, in the absence of anyone watching, runs the bases anyway. The Anchorage War Memorial stands in the Capital Wasteland as a tribute to the soldiers who fought in the Battle of Anchorage, the pre-war conflict in Alaska that forms the backdrop of the Operation Anchorage downloadable content. What makes the memorial interesting is the story of how it came to exist, at least within the world of the game. In the Operation Anchorage content, players can witness a photographer arranging a group of soldiers into a heroic pose. The photographer promises them fame. He tells them to hold still, to look strong, to look like the kind of men who deserve to be remembered. That photograph, taken in the middle of a war that has not yet ended, becomes the reference image for the statue that players can find back in the Capital Wasteland. The same pose, the same arrangement. The soldiers who held still for a moment in the middle of everything became the shape of the monument that was built in their honor. It is the kind of detail that rewards players who experience both the main game and the additional content. The statue was always there, but it means something different once you have seen where it came from. The pink power armor that never made it into the final game is one of those pieces of cut content that has taken on a life of its own among fans of Fallout 3. In the game's development files, there exists a complete set of power armor painted entirely in pink, including the helmet and emblazoned with a white heart on the chest. It also carries Brotherhood of Steel markings on the shoulders, which suggests it was once intended to belong to someone within that faction, or at least to comment on them in some way. No one on the development team has offered a clear explanation of what this armor was originally for. It may have been a joke. It may have been a concept that was developed further before being quietly removed. It may have been something planned for a character who never appeared in the finished game. What remains is the armor itself, sitting in the files, complete and detailed, and entirely unworn, a pink artifact from a version of the Capital Wasteland that players never got to visit. Fans who discovered it through data mining and modding tools have called it the Heartbreaker armor. The name was invented by the community, not the developers. But it fits. There is something quietly touching about a piece of equipment that was built with clear intention and care and then placed in a folder and forgotten, like a letter that was written and never sent. Galaxy News Radio Plaza contains an Easter egg that connects Fallout 3 back to the very origins of the series. Near the plaza, players can find a sculpture of a rocket ship orbiting a globe. It is a piece of decorative wreckage that might pass unnoticed by most players who are focused on the quests and enemies around it. But the shape is significant. The sculpture is a reference to Interplay, the company that created the original Fallout games before the license passed to Bethesda. The rocket orbiting a globe was the central image of Interplay's logo, the visual identity that appeared at the beginning of Fallout 1 and Fallout 2 before the games began. By placing it in the ruins of the Capital Wasteland, Bethesda quietly acknowledged the people who built the world they had inherited. The original creators were still there, in the form of a rusted sculpture sitting in a square where Three Dog broadcasts his radio signal into the gray sky. The connection was made even more explicit in a later Creation Club edition for Fallout 4, where the same Easter egg reappeared with a single ring added around the globe, matching the Interplay logo more precisely. 2 games, and more than a decade apart, and the tribute was still there, waiting to be noticed. Canterbury Commons offers one of the most unusual secondary storylines in the game. The town is home to a recurring conflict between 2 residents who have decided to become superheroes. One calls himself the Mechanist and has built a suit of robot-themed armor. The other calls herself the Ant Agonist and wears an insect-themed costume and has somehow arranged for giant ants to carry out her wishes. Their conflict disrupts the town repeatedly, and Uncle Ro, the town's self-appointed mayor, is thoroughly exhausted by the whole situation. What is interesting is what happens if the player eliminates both of these individuals during their first appearance, before the conflict has a chance to develop into the full questline. Uncle Ro reacts with a particular kind of weary gratitude that reveals how long he has been enduring this situation. His dialogue makes it clear that the town has been suffering through the Mechanist and the Ant Agonist's feud for some time, that people have been looking for someone to simply come in and end it. The player can do exactly that in a matter of seconds without ever learning the full backstory of either character. The Mechanist's story is later revisited in Fallout 4, where a version of the character appears in the Automatron downloadable content. But the Canterbury Commons version remains its own small tragedy and comedy wrapped together. 2 people who wanted to be extraordinary and instead became a nuisance that the whole town was trying to recover from. Paradise Falls is introduced as the Capital Wasteland's largest slaver settlement, a grim and imposing place built around commerce and human suffering. What is less immediately obvious is that its entrance gate has an interactive feature that most players ignore. The gate can be opened and closed by the player. It is a small mechanical detail, the kind of thing that adds texture to a location without changing anything about it functionally. The gate swings, the gate closes, and then the settlement continues to be exactly what it was before. The gate itself is built around the arm of a large pre-war statue, a Nuka-Cola tallboy figure that has been stripped of one appendage and repurposed as a sturdy crossbar for the entrance. The statue's missing limb is now a structural component of a slaver camp's front door. It is a perfect piece of environmental storytelling, the kind of detail that communicates volumes about how the people of the wasteland build their world, with whatever they can find, with whatever has survived, with the broken pieces of something else that once had a different purpose entirely. The Jefferson Memorial, known in the game as the location of Project Purity, holds a quiet secret that most players never discover unless they know to look. Within its walls, somewhere among the equipment and corridors that the player's father James used for his water purification work, is the room where the Lone Wanderer was actually born. The game establishes early on that the player was not born in Vault 101. They were brought to the vault as an infant by their father, who sought safety there after their mother, Catherine, died. That birth happened at the Jefferson Memorial, inside the facility where James was already working on Project Purity. The room is still there. The player can walk through it. It looks different now, marked by time and occupation and the events of the main quest. But the basic shape of it remains. There is no marker. There is no game prompt that says this is the place. The knowledge comes from piecing together the dialogue and the timeline, from connecting what James says about his past with the layout of the facility he worked in. Players who make that connection stand in the room where the Lone Wanderer's story technically began, years before Vault 101, years before the Overseer and the birthday and the childhood that the game presents as the starting point. Colonel Autumn's survival of the confrontation at Project Purity is one of those plot points that passed many players without explanation. James releases the forced evolutionary virus into the chamber where the Colonel is standing. The gas fills the room. The game implies strongly that Autumn does not make it. And then, several quests later, he reappears, entirely intact, without obvious injury, apparently unaffected by what should have been a lethal exposure. The explanation is in the animation, in a detail that plays out during the scene itself and is easy to miss. In the moment before the gas is released, Colonel Autumn pulls out a syringe and injects himself with something. The action is quick and happens during a tense confrontation where the player's attention is on the dialogue and the emotional weight of the moment. But it is there. The substance he injects is understood by fans and supported by game files to be a highly concentrated form of radaway or a related anti-radiation compound, something powerful enough to counteract the effects of the gas in the time it takes the room to fill. It is not explained in dialogue. It is not referenced again. It is simply a detail that exists in the animation of the scene, available to anyone who is watching closely enough and invisible to everyone else. The Capitol building in the Capital Wasteland has been occupied by a faction called the Talon Company Mercenaries for much of the game's timeline. But within its walls, in the decaying chambers that once held the legislative branch of the most powerful government in the country, there are terminals and documents that paint a picture of what the building was used for in the years immediately following the bombs. The records are fragmented, the accounts are partial, but they suggest that attempts were made in the early post-war period to maintain some form of governmental function inside the structure. People gathered, people made decisions, people tried to organize something from the wreckage of the old world in the chambers built for exactly that purpose. Those efforts did not survive. By the time the Lone Wanderer arrives, the building is fortified and hostile, held by mercenaries who have no interest in governance and every interest in maintaining control of the territory. But the terminals remember, the paper records remember. The shape of the building itself remembers, with its chambers and galleries and halls that were built for deliberation and now serve entirely different functions. The children of Little Lamplight live in a cave. They have always lived in a cave, or at least the ones who are there now have never known anything else. The community was founded generations ago when the bombs fell and a group of children sheltered in the cavern system, and, through a combination of determination and extraordinary circumstance, survived. The rule that was established, whether by necessity or superstition or some combination of both, is that residents must leave when they turn 16. Adults are not permitted inside. There is a child in Little Lamplight who mentions in passing that he plans to become president one day. The line is delivered with the casual confidence of a child who has not yet learned to be skeptical of his own ambitions. If the player returns after completing the main quest and checks in with this particular child, nothing has changed. He is still there. He is still the same age, as all the children in the game remain the same age. He will never leave the cave. He will never grow up. He will never become president. His ambition exists in a kind of permanent suspension, stated once and then sealed in amber by the logic of the game world, where time moves for the lone wanderer, but not for the people left behind. The super mutants who populate so much of the Capital Wasteland trace their origins to Vault 87, a facility located in the northern reaches of the map that is inaccessible through its main entrance due to lethal radiation levels. The forced evolutionary virus was used on the Vault's inhabitants, transforming them into the large and aggressive creatures that now wander the ruins of Washington. Vault 87 was not merely a vault. It was a production facility. The mutants it created have been expanding their presence in the region for decades by the time the game begins. What makes this origin particularly interesting is the scale of it. The super mutants of the Capital Wasteland are not a recent development or a localized problem. They have been there for a long time. They have their own hierarchy, their own language, their own rough culture. Some of them, the ones called behemoths, have grown to enormous size through continued exposure to the virus that created them. They wander alone, territorial and enormous, the extreme endpoint of a transformation that began in a single vault and spread across an entire region over the course of generations. The master behemoth, the largest super mutant in the game, is found inside Vault 87 itself. It is the endpoint of a journey into the place where the mutants were made. To find the largest and most powerful of the creatures, the player must enter the facility responsible for their existence. Now, there is a circular logic to it that feels entirely appropriate for a game built on the consequences of scientific decisions made before the bombs fell. Vault 112 is found buried beneath a junkyard. It is accessed through a garage and a staircase that descends into a level of the ground far below what the surface suggests. Once inside, the vault reveals itself to be something different from most. Its residents are not living out their days in corridors and cafeterias. They are sitting in pods. They are unconscious. They have been unconscious by the time the player arrives for over 200 years. The overseer of Vault 112 created a virtual reality environment called Tranquility Lane, a simulation of a 1950s American suburb, complete with houses and neighbors and a general store and a dog that wanders the streets. Within this simulation, the overseer controls everything. He has spent 2 centuries manipulating the residents of his simulated neighborhood, orchestrating conflict and distress, and worse among people who have no way to escape and no understanding of what has been done to them. He presents himself within the simulation as a little girl named Betty. The player enters Tranquility Lane to find their father, who was placed in a pod against his will. The father is inside the simulation, trying to find a way out, and the player must navigate the overseer's games in order to free him. There is an escape sequence available to players who explore the simulation carefully enough, involving an old pre-war computer terminal hidden inside one of the houses. The terminal triggers a program called the failsafe, and the failsafe has consequences that the overseer did not anticipate and cannot stop. The suburb ends, the pods open. 200 years of unconsciousness conclude in a moment. Vault 92 was built for musicians. The experiment conducted there concerned the relationship between music and behavior, specifically whether sound could be used as a vehicle for psychological conditioning without the subjects being aware of it. The vault was populated with talented musicians and artists, people who had been selected partly for their skills and partly for their psychological profiles, and subliminal programming was embedded into the music that played throughout the facility. Over time, the residents of Vault 92 began to experience paranoia, aggression, and eventually episodes of uncontrolled violence. The music that surrounded them, that they played and practiced and performed, was working on them in ways they could not perceive. By the time the experiment reached its final stages, the vault had descended into chaos. The instruments remained, the recording equipment remained, the music stands and sheet music and practice rooms all remained, but the musicians had destroyed each other and themselves, driven by something they could hear but not identify and could not escape. The lone wanderer finds the vault in that state, a museum of creative ambition that became something else entirely. The terminals tell the story in fragments. The bodies tell the rest of it in their arrangement. Vault 106 carried its experiment in the air. The oxygen recycling system was modified to introduce a hallucinogenic compound into the atmosphere on a gradual and increasing schedule. The residents breathed it in with every breath. They ate meals and attended to their duties and had conversations and fell asleep and woke up, all while their perceptions were being quietly altered. The vault's records suggest that the effects became noticeable within the first few months and catastrophic within the first year. The inhabitants who remain by the time the player visits are not hostile in the way most enemies are hostile. They are disturbed. Their behavior is erratic. They perceive threats that do not exist and miss dangers that do. Some of them have developed rituals and patterns that have no recognizable logic, responses to stimuli that only they can perceive. Vault 106 is one of the more unsettling locations in the game, not because of what it contains, but because of what it suggests about the nature of consciousness and how easily it can be redirected by something as invisible and necessary as the air in a room. The Riley's Rangers faction is a small group of mercenaries who specialize in mapping and exploring the Capital Wasteland. They occupy a particularly precarious position in the game's story, stranded on a rooftop surrounded by super mutants, waiting for rescue. The player can choose to help them or ignore them entirely. Most players who complete the associated quest remember the combat and the rooftop and the trip back to Riley, who offers a reward and some additional maps. What fewer players discover is that those maps actually expand the compass marker system in meaningful ways, adding markers for locations that are not otherwise labeled on the Pip-Boy. For players who enjoy exploration, the Ranger maps are one of the best rewards in the game. For players who complete the quest and immediately move on, the maps sit in inventory unconsulted, like a gift whose value was never quite understood. There is a character in the game named Roy Phillips who is involved in a quest concerning the residential tower known as Tenpenny Tower. The quest involves negotiation, or the possibility of negotiation, between the tower's human residents and a community of ghouls who want access to the building. The quest can be resolved in several ways. Players who manage to negotiate a peaceful settlement between the two groups and arrange for the ghouls to move in lawfully might expect this to represent a positive outcome. If the player returns to Tenpenny Tower sometime after achieving that peaceful resolution, the human residents are gone. All of them. Roy Phillips and the ghouls have killed them anyway. The negotiated peace did not hold. The concessions were not enough, or the resentments were too deep, or Roy Phillips simply did not want peace when he could have the tower entirely to himself. The bodies are in the basement, the ghouls are in the rooms, and the player who worked to achieve a diplomatic solution is left standing in a building where the outcome they worked for dissolved the moment they stopped watching. It is one of the more quietly devastating moments in the game, a demonstration that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes, and that the wasteland has its own logic that operates independently of what any individual player decides to do. The Citadel, the Brotherhood of Steel's base of operations in the Capital Wasteland, is built within and around the ruins of the Pentagon. The location choice is deliberate. The Brotherhood is an organization obsessed with military technology and the preservation of pre-war equipment and knowledge. They have established their headquarters in the former center of American military power, surrounded by the architecture of the institution whose legacy they have, in some ways, inherited and in other ways profoundly distorted. Inside the Citadel are facilities for research, training, and medical care. There are scribes who catalog and maintain technology. There are knights and paladins who carry out the Brotherhood's field operations. And there are, for those who explore carefully, recordings and terminals that reveal the internal debates within the organization about its purpose, its methods, and its future. Elder Lyons, the Brotherhood leader in Fallout 3, has made decisions that have alienated him from the main Brotherhood establishment on the West Coast. His focus on protecting civilians rather than simply acquiring technology is considered a deviation from Brotherhood doctrine. The Citadel is, among other things, a place where a splinter ideology is trying to justify itself. The Regulators are a faction that most players encounter only through the game's karma system. They are lawmen of a sort, self-appointed peacekeepers who patrol the Capital Wasteland and hunt down those they consider criminals. For players who maintain very good karma throughout the game, the Regulators become allies. For players who pursue a different path, the Regulators become a persistent threat, sending bounty hunters after the lone wanderer at regular intervals. What is less commonly noticed is the Regulator headquarters, a small building with a few characters who sell supplies and provide context for the organization. The Regulators do not have a significant presence in the main quest. They operate in the margins, doing their work in the spaces between the story's major events. Their headquarters is easy to miss entirely. Players who do find it encounter a faction that believes strongly in its own righteousness, that has drawn its own lines between acceptable and unacceptable behavior in the wasteland, and that enforces those lines with the same casual violence that it claims to oppose. The Silver Lining Drive-In is a location in the Capital Wasteland that houses an unusual resident. A man named Smiling Jack has set up a merchant operation at the ruined drive-in, selling weapons and ammunition in the shadow of the old outdoor movie screen. He is friendly. He is eager to trade. He has, as his name suggests, a persistent and possibly slightly unsettling smile. The drive-in itself is a piece of Americana that survived the bombs in the same battered fashion as everything else. The screen is still standing, partially. The speaker posts still line the parking area, or what remains of it. The concession stand still exists as a structure, now used for storage. Someone who had never seen a drive-in before would not recognize what this place was. Someone who knew what it was would feel the particular melancholy of recognizing a thing that has lost all context for its own existence. The Capitol Post building in the game contains terminals and records that provide a window into the journalism of pre-war America. The records include articles and drafts and editorial decisions, all of them reflecting the specific political atmosphere of a society that was simultaneously prosperous and heading toward catastrophic conflict. The tone of the articles is familiar in the way that propaganda always sounds familiar when you are inside it, and unsettling when you read it from the outside. The Capital Post's coverage was shaped by a government that had strong views about what the public should understand and strong mechanisms for encouraging the press to share those views. The terminals that hold these records are tucked into corners of the building and surrounded by enemies. Most players clear the enemies and move on. A smaller number stop at the terminals and read, and a smaller number still sit with the accumulated implications of what those terminals contain, the portrait of a society that convinced itself it was on the right path up until the moment everything ended. The Nuka-Cola quantum bottles scattered across the Capital Wasteland glow with a faint blue light. This is consistent with the canon explanation that the quantum formula included a trace amount of radioactive material that produced the distinctive bioluminescent effect. There are 63 quantum bottles in the game, and a quest in Rivet City that involves collecting them, offered by a woman named Sierra Petrovita, who has devoted an extraordinary amount of energy and attention to Nuka-Cola collecting. Sierra is one of those characters who might read as comedic on the surface, a grown woman who has organized her life around collecting soda bottles in a world where survival should theoretically be the only concern. But she is also, in her way, a portrait of something recognizable and even admirable. She has found a thing she loves in a world that has made loving things difficult. She pursues that love with consistency and enthusiasm. She knows every variety, every limited edition, every regional variant. The quantum bottles are the holy grail of her collection, and she asks the player to help her find them, not because she cannot find them herself, but because she wants company in the looking. Three Dog broadcasts from Galaxy News Radio, playing a mix of pre-war music and his own commentary on the events of the Capital Wasteland. His signal is weak when the game begins, barely reaching the areas around the radio station, limited by the damage to the relay equipment on top of the Washington Monument. A quest early in the game involves repairing that relay, which extends the signal's range and allows Three Dog's voice to reach further into the wasteland. The detail that most players do not notice is that Three Dog is aware of what the player is doing. He references the Lone Wanderer's actions on his broadcast, commenting on events after they occur, noting developments in the larger story from his position behind the microphone. He is not prescient. He is a reporter working with information that comes to him the same way information always comes to people in the wasteland, through rumor and traveler accounts and the slow drift of news across a landscape with no reliable communication infrastructure. But he is paying attention. He is keeping track. And for players who listen to his broadcasts between quests, his commentary provides a second perspective on events that the player has experienced directly. Megaton is built around a live atomic bomb. This is the most immediately striking fact about the settlement, the detail that defines it before anything else does. The bomb sits in a crater at the center of the town, half buried in the ground, surrounded by makeshift structures and a population that has built an entire community in the shadow of a weapon that has never detonated. The children of Adam, the religion that reveres radiation and nuclear power, have a shrine in Megaton beside the bomb. Their presence here is not coincidental. The bomb is sacred to them, a symbol of the transformative power they believe will eventually remake the world. The townsfolk have made an uneasy peace with the bomb and with the worshippers who gather around it. It is the kind of accommodation that only a post-apocalyptic world requires, the normalization of something that would be unthinkable in any other context. There is a man named Mr. Burke in Megaton who approaches the player early in the game with a proposal. He wants the bomb detonated. He works for a man named Alistair Tenpenny, who lives in a luxury tower on the far edge of the wasteland and wants a clear view from his penthouse window. The payment offered for triggering the bomb's detonation is substantial. The quest allows the player to proceed through the entire process of arming the bomb, building a relationship with Burke, and then returning to Tenpenny Tower to observe the detonation from a safe distance. If the player chooses to detonate Megaton, the game follows through completely. The town is destroyed. The characters who lived there are gone. The quest givers who had things to offer are no longer available. The decisions that depended on Megaton as a hub need to be rerouted. The game does not shield the player from the consequences of that choice. It simply presents the consequences and continues. The Broken Steel downloadable content raises the level cap and allows the story to continue past the ending. One of its notable features is that President Eden, the artificial intelligence that runs Raven Rock and claims to be the elected leader of the Enclave, can appear at the Citadel after certain conditions are met. A player who encountered a bug in their game after completing the main quest and beginning Broken Steel reported seeing Eden walking around the Citadel without being interactable. The bug placed him in an environment he was never meant to occupy, standing among the Brotherhood of Steel soldiers and scribes as if he had simply decided to visit. The creator of the almost 2 hours of useless Fallout 3 Facts video mentioned this particular glitch in their opening moments, noting that it was unclear how common the bug was and inviting viewers to share their own experiences. It is the kind of glitch that becomes memorable precisely because it is so incongruous. A character who represents the corrupted remnant of the old government appearing in the home of the organization that opposed him, doing nothing, saying nothing, or just standing there. The water of the Potomac River runs through the Capital Wasteland in a state of heavy irradiation. Crossing the river is dangerous. Wading through it causes radiation damage. The river's condition is a direct consequence of the war that ended civilization. A body of water that once defined the geography of the nation's capital, now transformed into a hazard that shapes how players move through the landscape. Project Purity, the central goal of the main quest, is specifically about purifying this water, about restoring the Potomac and its tributaries to a state where they can support life rather than threaten it. James spent decades working on the technology needed to accomplish this purification. The Jefferson Memorial was chosen as the site because of its proximity to the river and its existing infrastructure. The entire arc of the main story is about whether the purification can be completed and who will control the resulting clean water supply. The Enclave wants control of Project Purity because clean water is power. In a wasteland where survival depends on managing radiation exposure, a controlled supply of purified water gives whoever holds it extraordinary leverage over the population. The Brotherhood of Steel wants to prevent the Enclave from achieving that leverage. The player's father wanted something simpler and more idealistic to complete his life's work and give the water to everyone. The Rivet City settlement floats in the Anacostia River on the rusted hull of a pre-war aircraft carrier. It is one of the most defensible and organized settlements in the Capital Wasteland, with a working market, a research facility, and a population that includes historians, traders, doctors, and a small security force. The science lab within Rivet City is where Dr. Madison Lee, one of James's former colleagues, has continued her own research in the years since she left Project Purity. The carrier itself is enormous, larger than any of the game's other settlement structures, and the way Rivet City is built onto and into it gives the settlement a particular layered quality. The accessible areas represent only part of the vessel. There are flooded sections and sealed compartments and structural damage that limits movement through the ship. The people who live there know the carrier's layout in the intimate way that anyone comes to know a place they have inhabited for years, moving around the obstacles and the damaged sections as naturally as they move around furniture. The history of how Rivet City was founded is told through a series of holotapes and terminal records scattered through the settlement. A faction within the community once held a different vision for what the carrier could become, and the resolution of that internal conflict shaped the city into what it is when the player arrives. The story is available to anyone who looks for it, told in the voices of people who have since died, preserved in the recordings they left behind. The Lincoln Memorial presents one of the more politically layered locations in the game. By the time the player encounters it, the memorial has been occupied by slavers from Paradise Falls. Lincoln's statue, the tablets displaying the Gettysburg Address, and the second inaugural, the reflecting pool extending before the steps, all of it is now part of a slaver territory. There is a group of freed slaves, a resistance organization called the Abolitionists, who want to retake the memorial. There is a museum nearby that holds artifacts from Lincoln's presidency. The game's handling of this location is careful. The irony of slavers occupying the Lincoln Memorial is not underscored with speeches or heavy-handed commentary. It is simply there, present in the geography of the location, available for players to respond to in whatever way they choose. The memorial can be reclaimed, the slavers can be driven out, the space can be returned to something closer to what it represents, or the player can interact with the situation on entirely different terms or ignore it altogether. The Washington Monument relay antenna, once repaired, extends Three Dogs' signal, but the monument itself, rising above the wasteland, is one of the few intact landmarks that can be seen from great distances. It functions as a navigation point, a fixed star in the geography of the ruined city, visible from positions far enough out that the ruins of the Capitol begin to blur together into an indistinct mass of gray. The monument's presence at the center of the map makes it a kind of anchor, the thing you orient to when you have lost your bearings. Near the end of the game, during the assault on the Jefferson Memorial, the player fights through Enclave soldiers to reach the purification chamber. The combat is intense, and the stakes are clear. But scattered through the facility, accessible between the fighting, are terminals that tell the story of Project Purity's final days before the Enclave arrived. James's voice, already heard throughout the main quest, appears again in these records, describing his work and his hopes, and his growing anxiety about who might come for what he was building. He was right to be anxious. He was working on the most valuable thing in the Capital Wasteland, something that everyone with power would want to control. His idealism about distributing the water freely was always going to collide with the reality of what pure water means in a world where radiation is everywhere. The terminals document the approach of that collision, the days and weeks before the Enclave arrived, the final entries written by someone who knew that the work he had dedicated his life to was about to become something he never intended. The Nuka-Cola plant near the center of the map is one of the larger explorable buildings in the game. It was, before the war, a production facility for the Nuka-Cola brand, responsible for manufacturing the beverage that had become synonymous with pre-war American consumer culture. The plant is still full of equipment, still lined with bottling machinery and conveyor systems, still organized around the logic of production, even though the production stopped 2 centuries ago. The machines are all still in their places. The bottles are still on the lines. The Nuka-Cola signs are still on the walls, with their cheerful mascot and their brightly colored advertising. The plant is one of the most vividly preserved pieces of pre-war infrastructure in the game, a place where the consumer world of the old country survived almost intact while everything outside its walls was destroyed. It is also full of raiders and Nuka-Cola themed enemies by the time the player arrives, which is the Capital Wasteland's way of saying that nothing stays preserved for long, that eventually everything gets occupied and repurposed and turned into something different from what it was. But the machinery is still there, the lines are still there, and somewhere in the conveyor systems, in the bottling floors, the ghost of the old world's most successful soft drink company continues to haunt its ruined factory. The Dunwich Building is one of Fallout 3's explicitly horror-adjacent locations. It is a ruined office building that, upon exploration, reveals itself to have a relationship with the occult that predates the nuclear war entirely. The building's lower levels contain obelisks with pre-war inscriptions that reference an entity called Ugg Qualtoth. The deeper the player goes, the more disturbing the environment becomes. There are hallucinations. There are sounds that do not have clear sources. There is a connection to a pre-war cult that used the building's basement as a ritual site. The horror of the Dunwich Building operates differently from the combat-based challenges of most locations. It unsettles rather than attacks. The enemies present within it are real enough, but they are almost secondary to the atmosphere, which accumulates in layers as the player descends. The name Dunwich is a reference to H.P. Lovecraft, specifically to his story of the same name. The connection is intentional and reinforced by the building's content. In a world defined by the rational horror of nuclear warfare and its consequences, the Dunwich Building insists on a different kind of horror entirely, older and less explicable, and the game allows it to exist without resolving what it means. The Point Lookout downloadable content introduces a swamp environment that feels entirely unlike the Capital Wasteland. The location is based on a real Maryland state park, and it brings with it a climate and a palette and a level of overgrowth that makes it feel like a different world. The swamp has its own mysteries, its own history, its own factions, operating according to their own logic. The main story of Point Lookout involves a pre-war spy operation and a tribal community with deep roots in the region's history. What gives Point Lookout its particular character is the sense of age that pervades it. The Capital Wasteland has 200 years of post-war history. Point Lookout feels older than that. The tribals who live there carry traditions that predate the war. The structures and rituals and stories have been passed down through generations that no longer have a clear memory of what came before them. By the time the player arrives, the distinction between pre-war history and post-war mythology has dissolved. Everything that happened here happened a long time ago, and the people who remember it in the particular way that communities remember things, not as facts, but as shapes. The Mothership Zeta downloadable content is among the most unusual additions to Fallout 3's world. It places the player aboard an alien spacecraft that has been capturing humans throughout history, including notable pre-war individuals preserved in stasis. The content is distinct in tone from the rest of the game, operating more as science fiction adventure than post-apocalyptic exploration. It was received with mixed responses, partly because it sits so oddly alongside the rest of the Capital Wasteland's established atmosphere. Within the spacecraft, there are recordings left by the humans who were captured, some of them dating back centuries, all of them trying to make sense of their situation. There is a frontier woman who left her family to do farm chores and ended up on a spacecraft. There is a samurai whose recordings exist in a language that the player cannot understand without translation. There is a cowboy who adapted to his circumstances with what sounds like genuine equanimity. The diversity of the captives spans vast stretches of time and suggests that the aliens have been watching Earth and taking samples of its population for an extraordinarily long period. The alien weapons available in the content are among the most powerful in the game. They are also, by definition, unlike anything that could have been developed on Earth, representative of a technology that operates according to principles that the Capital Wasteland's craftspeople and engineers would have no framework for understanding. Bringing one of those weapons back into the main game world and using it against the enemies, there has a particular quality, the sense of an object that has no natural place in its environment, carried by someone who obtained it through circumstances that no one would believe if they described them. The Pit downloadable content takes the player to Pittsburgh, or what remains of it. The city became a particular kind of hell after the war, its industrial foundations twisted into something monstrous. The Pit is a slave city, organized around a mill that continues to produce steel. The slaves work. The raiders who hold power do not. The arrangement is maintained through force and fear. What the content reveals as the story develops is a complexity to the situation that the initial presentation obscures. There is a cure for the mutation that affects the mill's workers, a cure that exists in the form of an infant. The options available to the player for dealing with the situation include choices that are not easily resolved by any simple ethical framework. The Pit is one of the more morally demanding pieces of downloadable content in the Fallout series, not because it puts players in dramatic combat situations, but because it forces them to engage with questions that do not have clean answers. The Broken Steel content changes the game's ending in a significant way. Originally, Fallout 3 ended with the player entering the purification chamber and activating Project Purity, an action that results in a lethal dose of radiation. The game concluded there, presenting the Lone Wanderer's sacrifice as the story's final moment. Broken Steel added the ability to have a companion enter the chamber instead, continuing past the ending into an extended story involving the Enclave's remnants and the Brotherhood's efforts to stabilize the Capital Wasteland. The change was widely requested by players who wanted to continue playing after the main quest concluded. It also introduced narrative complications that the original ending had avoided, specifically the question of why the player could not simply put on a hazmat suit or take anti-radiation medication before entering the chamber. The lore attempted to address these questions, but the more important point is that Broken Steel allowed the game to continue, allowed the world to continue, allowed the player to remain in the Capital Wasteland after the story that had structured their experience that reached its resolution. One of the quieter details in the entire game is the state of Springvale Elementary School, located near Vault 101. The school was a functioning educational facility in the pre-war period. By the time the game begins, it has been taken over by raiders who have fortified it in the rough and improvisational way that raiders fortify everything. The classrooms still contain the shapes of their original purpose: desks and chalkboards, the organizational logic of a space designed for teaching children. The raiders move through these spaces without any apparent awareness of what those spaces once were. They eat where children once learned arithmetic. They sleep where children once heard stories. The school is not presented as a tragedy by the game. It is simply a building with enemies inside it, like many other buildings in the Capital Wasteland. But the contrast between what it was and what it has become is present in the visual language of the space for anyone who chooses to look at it with that kind of attention. The Enclave's technology is dramatically more advanced than anything available to the Wasteland's other factions. They have functioning vertibirds, helicopter-like aircraft that they use for transport and combat. They have advanced versions of power armor. They have access to chemicals and weapons that require infrastructure well beyond what any settlement in the Capital Wasteland could produce. The explanation for this advantage is that the Enclave has maintained its technological capabilities through a combination of pre-war stockpiling and ongoing research in their base at Raven Rock, a facility that was designed to survive a nuclear strike and has been functioning continuously since before the bombs fell. Raven Rock itself is one of the game's more impressive interiors. It is large and functional in a way that most locations in the game are not, still running on power that has not failed, still organized around the logic of a military installation that continues to operate. The contrast with the ruins outside is stark. The Enclave's world looks like the world before the bombs, maintained and lit and functional. The rest of the wasteland looks like what happened after them. The character of Fox is a super mutant found inside Vault 87. His separation from the other mutants and his preservation of intellectual function make him unique among the super mutants that's encountered in the game. He was a human who was exposed to the forced evolutionary virus and transformed, but something in the transformation went differently for him. He retained the ability to read, to reason, to express complex thought. He has been imprisoned in Vault 87 long enough to have read every book in the facility. Fox can become a companion. He is among the most powerful companions in the game, capable of absorbing extraordinary amounts of damage. He is also, in his conversations with the player, one of the more philosophically interesting characters, someone who exists in a condition that no framework quite accounts for, too intelligent and self-aware to be what the other mutants are, too physically transformed to be what he was before the virus changed him. He occupies a space between categories that the wasteland has no word for. He seems to have made a kind of peace with that. The Galaxy News Radio building is surrounded by super mutants. 3 dog broadcasts from inside it, separated from the wasteland's most common threat by walls and improvised defenses, and the simple fact that the mutants have not yet gotten through. A quest involves fighting through those mutants to reach the building and meet 3 Dog in person. The fight to get there is the kind of intense, building-by-building urban combat that the Capital Wasteland excels at, using the ruins of the city as a layered tactical environment. Inside the building, 3 Dog's operation is smaller than his voice suggests. The radio equipment fills a few rooms. The records he plays are stacked and ordered with the care of someone who understands that they are irreplaceable. He has what he needs to broadcast, and not much more. The voice that reaches across the Capital Wasteland and provides something like a common cultural reference point for its scattered population comes from a man in a small room surrounded by super mutants, playing pre-war music on equipment he cannot replace if it breaks. The Nuka-Cola quartz variety emits a faint glow that is visible in dark environments. This luminescence was implemented by the development team using a light-emitting texture that was originally created for laser weapons. The visual effect was repurposed to give the quantum variant its distinctive blue radiance without building new systems to produce it. The result is a bottle that glows in the dark in a way that has no functional purpose for the player, but that has made it one of the more memorable collectibles in the game. Sierra Petrovita knows about this. She knows about all of them. Her collection, maintained in her home in Girdershade, represents years of patient searching through the Capital Wasteland's ruins and vendors. She is the world's foremost expert on Nuka-Cola varieties, by default if nothing else, since she appears to be the only person in the region who cares about the distinction. Her enthusiasm is not ironic. It is genuine, and it is the kind of genuine enthusiasm that survives catastrophe by finding something it loves and holding on. The letter that Vault-Tec sent to rejected applicants mentioned a waiting list. This is the kind of detail that is funnier and sadder the longer you think about it. Vault-Tec maintained a waiting list for shelter during a nuclear apocalypse. Families paid deposits and were placed on lists and were instructed to contact their local representative for information about facilities with available spots. The corporate machinery of survival continued to function exactly as corporate machinery functions, right up until the moment when the bombs made waiting lists irrelevant. The families who received rejection letters were not necessarily worse off than the families who received acceptance letters. The vaults had their own horrors, their own experiments, their own overseers who used the captive populations for purposes that had nothing to do with genuine shelter. Some of the people who were turned away by Vault Tech and had to find their own way through the bomb's aftermath developed communities and survival strategies that served them better than the Vault experience served its residents. The waiting list, in retrospect, was rejection from one form of harm on behalf of exposure to another. The story of the Capital Wasteland is ultimately a story about what survives. Not just physically, not just in terms of buildings and structures and machinery, but culturally, emotionally, in terms of what people carried with them into the new world and what they were able to hold on to after everything else was gone. Pre-war books on random shelves, a baseball player at an abandoned field, a sculptor's tribute to soldiers who posed for a photograph in the middle of a war, letters in mailboxes waiting for people who can no longer receive them. These things that survive. They persist in the rubble of civilization, not because anyone preserved them intentionally, but because the world of Fallout is built by people who understood that the small things are what finally tell the story. The monuments and the declarations and the official records are all there too, but they are legible to anyone. The small things require attention. They require the patience to look at the corner of a shelf or the inside of a mailbox or the behavior of a single character in a single location and to think about what that reveals. The lone wanderer's journey through the Capital Wasteland is a journey through exactly that kind of attention. Every ruined house contains someone's last arrangements of their belongings. Every terminal holds someone's last words about their life before the bombs or their life in the days immediately after. Every abandoned building has a history written in its layout and its contents for anyone willing to read it. The game rewards that reading with something that most games cannot offer, the gradual accumulation of a complete world, assembled fact by quiet fact from hundreds of details that were each placed with care by people who understood that the sum of small things is a world. The Capital Wasteland is as rich as it is because of those small things. The baseball player, the pink armor, the waiting list, the child who wants to be president and will never leave the cave. The Capital Wasteland sleeps under a sky that has been gray for 200 years. The radiation has calmed from the impossible levels of the immediate aftermath. The settlements have found their shapes. The factions have drawn their territories. The lone wanderer has come and gone, and the water flows now through purification systems built in the shadow of the Jefferson Memorial by a man who spent his life on exactly that purpose. The Raider is still running the bases at Fordham Flash Memorial Field, somewhere in the game files, in the unchanging afternoon of a world that does not update its idle animations when no one is watching. The two vault guards are still standing at the threshold of Vault 101, unable to cross into the open air, doing their duty in the only terms they know. The child in Little Lamplight still plans to become president with all the confidence of someone who has not yet learned why that confidence is heartbreaking. There is a merchant named Crow who wanders the Capital Wasteland in a large metal container that looks from the outside like an enclosed wagon. He carries a selection of goods and makes his way from location to location on a route that covers a significant portion of the map. What makes Crow interesting is that he has a Protectron robot bodyguard traveling with him, and the combination of the walking merchant and his mechanical companion is one of those traveling encounters that the Capital Wasteland uses to suggest a world in motion between the locations the player visits. Crow himself is not particularly talkative. He conducts business with efficiency and moves on. But the fact that he has figured out a mobile merchant operation, that he has made the calculation that moving through the wasteland with a robot and a large container is sustainable enough to constitute a living, says something about the economies that have developed in the 2 centuries since the bombs. Trade happens, merchants move. The wasteland has its circuits and rhythms that continue regardless of whether the player is paying attention to them. The Regulator faction has a small detail in their bounty system that many players never discover. For players maintaining very good karma, the Regulators will deliver payment directly. A Lawbringer perk can be taken that allows the collection of bounties for killing evil-aligned characters by taking their fingers to the Regulator headquarters. The perk creates a quiet economic logic to certain kinds of violence. A bounty system operating in the spaces between the game's major factions, rewarding the player for actions they might take anyway. The counterpart perk for players who pursue a darker path is the Contract Killer perk, which allows collection of ear trophies from good-aligned characters in exchange for payment from a mysterious dark organization. Neither perk is prominently advertised. They exist as options for players who have thought carefully about their character's relationship to violence, who want that relationship to have a mechanical expression within the game's systems. The National Mall in Fallout 3 is a contested zone. The Brotherhood of Steel and the super mutants fight over the area in a persistent conflict that continues regardless of player involvement. Crossing the mall becomes a tactical exercise in navigating the lines of an ongoing battle, using cover, timing movement to avoid incoming fire from both sides, trying to reach the monuments and museums that dot the landscape without becoming a casualty of someone else's war. The Smithsonian Institution's Museum of Natural History is one of the buildings available for exploration along the mall. Inside, the ancient and the apocalyptic are layered together in a way that is sometimes sublime. Pre-war exhibits, prepared before the bombs fell with the care and scholarship that museum work requires, have survived alongside the destruction. The dinosaur exhibit still stands. The gems and minerals collection is still present. The Blue Hope diamond is gone from its display case, having been removed and placed elsewhere in the museum by the ghouls who occupy the building, for reasons known only to them. The Museum of Technology presents pre-war achievements in science and engineering. It includes exhibits on the space program, on nuclear power, on computing and communication technology. The exhibits document the achievements of a civilization that was advancing rapidly in some areas while making catastrophic decisions in others, a portrait of the pre-war world's particular combination of innovation and destruction. The Virgo 2 lunar lander is present in the space section, suggesting that the Fallout world's pre-war America achieved its own version of the moon landing, though the timeline and the details differ from the historical record of our own world. The Wasteland Survival Guide quest is offered by Moira Brown, who operates a shop called Craterside Supply in Megaton. Moira is an inventor and a researcher with a genuine scientific curiosity about the conditions of the Capital Wasteland. Her research project involves sending the player into dangerous situations to gather information for a survival guide she is writing and intends to publish. The guide is meant to help future wanderers understand their environment and make better decisions. Moira's approach to research is enthusiastic and occasionally alarming. She wants the player to be injured to test the effectiveness of stim packs. She wants data on radiation exposure. She wants information about the super mutants and the mole rats and the mirelurks. The quest sends the player into situations that are genuinely hazardous in the name of empirical inquiry. What gives Moira her particular character is that she means well, absolutely and completely. She is curious about the wasteland, the way a scientist is curious, without the emotional armor that curiosity usually requires to survive that kind of direct contact with danger. The finished Wasteland Survival Guide, available in the game if the quest is completed, actually provides in-game bonuses. Reading the different chapters of the guide gives the player small stat improvements that persist through the rest of the experience. Moira's research, gathered at significant cost to the player, translates into something useful. The guide works. It is one of the more quietly satisfying payoffs in the game, the knowledge that an eccentric inventor's project was worth the trouble. Tenpenny Tower is home to a character named Alastair Tenpenny himself, an elderly British man who has built his luxury residence in the tower that bears his name and watches the Capital Wasteland from his penthouse balcony with the detached satisfaction of someone who is comfortable enough to view the suffering below as scenery. Tenpenny's accent is one of the more unusual details in a game set around Washington, D.C. He is an immigrant who arrived from somewhere on what was once the British Isles, which suggests that the post-war world retained enough of a ship-based transportation infrastructure to allow for transatlantic movement. His history, available through conversations and terminal records, involves military service and mercantile activity that eventually accumulated into the wealth and influence required to build a tower and retire into comfortable observation. He did not build the wasteland he surveys from his balcony. He profited from it. Tenpenny Tower is not a community built by its residents. It is a monument to one person's success, maintained by staff who serve at his pleasure, defended by mercenaries who work for his continued comfort. The game allows players to interact with Tenpenny on his own terms or to involve themselves in the disputes that surround his tower. His character is not particularly subtle. He represents a very specific kind of post-apocalyptic, wealthy detachment. But the detail of his British origin gives him a dimension that purely local characters would not have. A reminder that the wasteland has connections and histories that extend beyond the immediate geography of the Capital Wasteland. The Arlington Cemetery is an explorable location in the game. It carries its history on its surface in the way that cemeteries always do, the rows of markers, each representing a life and a name and a death. In the post-war period, the cemetery has continued to accumulate significance, though not through formal addition, but through the way that ruins accumulate meaning by existing in their ruined state. The markers from before the war are still there, the names on them still legible to anyone who stops to read them. There are ghouls in the cemetery. They wander among the markers with the purposeless movement of enemies who occupy a space without any relationship to what that space once was. The contrast is not commented upon. It is simply present, part of the landscape of a location that the game allows the player to move through and interpret for themselves. Some players pass through the cemetery quickly, managing the combat and moving on. Others pause. Others read the markers and think about the distance between what the cemetery was built to commemorate and what it has become. The Old Olney settlement is one of the most dangerous locations in the game for low-level players who encounter it without preparation. The town is populated almost exclusively by deathclaws, the result of an established nest in the area that has spread through the streets and buildings. Deathclaws appear throughout the Capital Wasteland, but Old Olney has them in concentration, making the small town one of the few locations where entering requires careful thought about timing and equipment. The town itself, beneath its dangerous occupants, contains the usual evidence of the lives that were lived there before the war and before the deathclaws. Houses with furniture, a church, a hardware store, the physical residue of a community that had no awareness of what was coming, either the bombs or the creatures that would eventually take over its streets. Old Olney is a small place that the game did not need to populate with Deathclaws but chose to, making it a memorable hazard within a landscape that already contains many hazards. The Deathclaw Sanctuary is a cave system that contains a large number of Deathclaws in what appears to be a natural habitat. It is one of the few locations in the game that suggests Deathclaws have something like a natural environment, a place they occupy, not because they have taken over a human settlement, but because the cave suits their existence. The sanctuary contains loot that rewards the significant risk required to navigate it, but it also rewards players with a glimpse of Deathclaw behavior in an environment they have organized around their own needs rather than around the disruption of someone else's. The Deathclaws of the Capital Wasteland have their own origin story within the larger Fallout lore. They were originally chameleons that were genetically modified before the war to be used as weapons in combat. The modifications gave them their enormous size, their claws, their speed, and aggression. After the bombs fell, the surviving specimens bred in the wild, and natural selection continued the process of making them more dangerous across generations. The Deathclaw the player encounters 2 centuries after the war is the product of both deliberate creation and unguided evolution, a natural thing built on an unnatural foundation. The Outcasts are a splinter group of the Brotherhood of Steel who separated from Elder Lyons' command and established their own base at Fort Independence. Their disagreement with Lyons is philosophical as well as strategic. The Outcasts believe the Brotherhood's mission is the acquisition and preservation of pre-war technology, not the protection of wasteland civilians. Lyons' focus on fighting super mutants and helping ordinary people strikes them as a misuse of the Brotherhood's resources and purpose. Fort Independence is accessible to players who seek it out, and the Outcasts will trade with those who bring them pre-war technology. They are not friendly in the casual way that allied factions can be friendly. They are precise and transactional and fundamentally uninterested in the Lone Wanderer's broader story. Their single-minded focus on technology collection makes them easier to characterize than to sympathize with, but their argument about the Brotherhood's purpose is one that the game does not entirely dismiss. Lyons has, by many measures, built something admirable. The question of whether he has also betrayed the institution he leads is one the game leaves open. The Talon Company mercenaries appear throughout the game as enemies who attack the player on sight once a certain karma threshold is crossed in the positive direction. They are, effectively, the bounty hunters for players who are doing too much good in the Capital Wasteland. Their existence as a threat introduces an interesting constraint on heroic behavior, the knowledge that doing right by too many people will eventually bring professional killers to your location. Their employer is not definitively revealed within the main game. The Talon Company takes contracts and carries them out. The contract against the Lone Wanderer is active if karma is sufficiently high. The identity of whoever placed that contract is a mystery that the game provides hints about but does not resolve conclusively. It is one of several narrative threads in Fallout 3 that are left deliberately incomplete, present enough to imply depth, incomplete enough to leave room for imagination. The Temple of the Union is a small fortification north of the main map, occupied by escaped slaves who have formed a community devoted to the principles of freedom. The group is led by a man named Hannibal Hamlin, a name that echoes that of Abraham Lincoln's first vice president. The connection is intentional and reinforces the thematic relationship between the Lincoln Memorial quests and this location. The Temple of the Union is a community of people who have been owned by others and refused that condition, and their name and their leader's name place them in a specific historical conversation about what freedom means and who has been denied it. The escaped slaves of the Temple of the Union are trying to reach the Lincoln Memorial, which holds symbolic significance for their community. Their journey and the obstacles in their path form one of the game's quieter extended storylines, available to players who find the settlement and choose to help. It does not have the drama of the main quest. It is simply a group of people trying to reach a place that means something to them, carrying the idea of that meaning with them across a dangerous landscape. Vault 108 contains the Garys. The entire population of Vault 108 has been replaced over time by clones of a single resident named Gary. The original Gary was a hostile and unstable individual whose cloning program was part of the Vault's experiment. By the time the player arrives, the Vault is inhabited entirely by Gary clones, each one hostile, each one capable of only one word of speech, each one bearing the same face and the same name. The Garys move through the Vault's corridors like a distorted echo, a whole community reduced to a single, repeated identity. The experiment that created the Garys is, within the logic of the game, a straightforward piece of Vault horror. But the execution of it has made Vault 108 one of the more memorable locations in the game, precisely because its central horror is so absurd. A vault full of one person shouting the same name over and over is not the most elaborate concept in Fallout 3's vault design. It is, however, one of the most immediately distinctive, the kind of thing that stays with players, because it is so specifically strange. The Jefferson Memorial's rotunda contains a mural that depicts the history of Project Purity and the ideals behind it. The mural was painted during the early years of the project, when James and his colleagues still believed they would be able to complete it within a reasonable time frame. The optimism in the imagery is visible, the figures reaching toward purified water, the clean world that the project was intended to help create. By the time the player sees it, that optimism has been tested by decades of delay and failure and loss. The mural's aspirations survived all of that. The project eventually did too. The Nuka-Cola plant's storage areas contain bottles that were never shipped, production runs that were completed, and then trapped inside the facility when the bombs fell. The bottles have survived in their crates for 2 centuries, and Nuka-Cola produced with pre-war recipes and ingredients is, within the fiction of the game, significantly different from whatever post-war operations might have attempted to replicate the formula. Sierra Petrovita would find this significant. Most players simply take the bottles for their minor restorative properties and continue through the building without considering the supply chain disruption that left them there. The pre-war money found throughout the Capital Wasteland has an interesting double function within the game's economy. It can be used as a crafting material, converted into other useful components, but it also retains value as currency among those who have decided it has value, which is its own quiet philosophical statement about how currency works in any economic system. The paper bills are aesthetically pre-war, bearing the faces of the old government's treasury designs, representing a financial system that ceased to function 2 centuries before the player picks them up. Their value is entirely assigned, a collective decision by the people who trade with them that the old money still means something. The hollowed-out rock is a hiding place that some players find early, and others discover only after many hours. Scattered throughout the Capital Wasteland are rocks that look like all the other rocks, but that are actually containers, storage spaces that can be used to hide items, or that sometimes contain items left by other travelers. The hiding place concept rewards players who interact with environmental details that have no obvious reason to be interactive. Most rocks are not hiding places. Most environmental objects in any location are not interactive. But some of them are, and the only way to know which ones is to try, or to read about it, or to happen upon one at exactly the right angle while moving through a landscape that contains thousands of similar objects. Galaxy News Radio plays music that was popular in the pre-war period. Three Dogs' selections lean toward the optimistic and the ironic, songs about happiness and love and the future playing over a landscape that has experienced the maximum possible amount of bad news. The music choices are not accidental. The contrast between the lyrics and the landscape is part of how Fallout's particular brand of dark humor operates, finding the space between what the old world promised and what the new world delivered. The songs themselves are actual pre-war recordings, real music from the 20th century licensed for the game. They exist in the fictional world as pre-war music because they were, in our world, actually recorded before a certain point in time. The overlap between real history and fictional history in Fallout's timeline is deliberately permeable in these moments, allowing the game's emotional palette to borrow from the genuine associations that these songs carry in the real world. The Lone Wanderer's Pip-Boy is a Model 3000, equipped before leaving Vault 101 by the player's father. The Pip-Boy functions as the game's primary interface, the device through which inventory, maps, quests, and the radio are all accessed. Within the fiction of the game, it is a piece of Vault-issue technology given to Vault residents as a standard piece of equipment. The Model 3000 is slightly different from the Pip-Boys seen in other Fallout games, reflecting the different Vault technology available in the Capital Wasteland region compared to the West Coast facilities that appear in earlier entries. The device is physically attached to the player's arm throughout the entire game. It cannot be removed. It is not a carried item, but a piece of equipment that has been integrated into the Lone Wanderer's daily existence from a very early age. The player never thinks of it as unusual because they have always had it. That familiarity is part of the fiction of the character, someone for whom this piece of advanced technology is as natural as breathing, as much a part of their identity as anything else they carry out of the vault. The super mutant behemoths are among the most visually distinctive enemies in the game, enormous figures that stand far above the regular super mutants and carry improvised weapons built from debris and vehicles. There are 5 named behemoths in the game, placed in specific locations throughout the Capital Wasteland. They are not randomly generated. Each one occupies a specific location, and each one has been placed with thought about the narrative weight of encountering it there. The behemoth at the Galaxy News Radio Plaza is one of the earliest that most players encounter. It stands in the road outside the building, holding a fire hydrant that it uses as a weapon. The encounter is scripted to include Brotherhood soldiers fighting the creature from multiple angles, giving the confrontation a quality of desperate coordination against an enemy that individual resistance cannot easily stop. The scale of the behemoth in that urban setting, the fire hydrant pulled from the street used as a bludgeon, the buildings that have survived as the backdrop to a fight between humans and something that was human and is now this, all of it contributes to the moment's particular character. The Vault Tech headquarters building in the northern part of the Capital Wasteland contains records about the Vault program's planning and execution. The documents available there provide context for what was understood about the experiments, what was justified internally, what was hidden from the public. The corporate language of the records is consistent throughout, the careful management of uncomfortable facts through the application of sufficient abstraction. The word experiment appears many times. The word victim does not appear at all. The headquarters is, by the time the player visits, a ruin like everything else. The company that built the Vault program operated from a building that is now occupied by robots, still following the last instructions they were given before the bombs fell. The robots continue their work in the offices and server rooms of a company that no longer exists, for a population that was either never helped or was subjected to the experiments that the headquarters helped design. The robots do not appear to find this situation unusual. They were not programmed to find it unusual. The Robco facility is another pre-war industrial location, this one associated with the robotics and computing company whose products appear throughout the Capital Wasteland. Protectrons, Mr. Handys, sentry bots, the various automated systems that still function in ruins across the map, all of them trace their origin to Robco Industries. The facility itself is occupied by robots that are still running programs they were assigned decades or centuries ago, maintaining an inventory of products and parts in a building whose context no longer exists. Robco is presented in the game as one of the defining companies of pre-war America, along with Vault-Tec and Nuka-Cola. Its products are everywhere in a way that suggests the company achieved a market dominance that survived competition and consolidation to become the default supplier of computing and robotic technology for the entire country. The Pip-Boy itself is technically a Robco product. The company's reach into every corner of the pre-war world means its ruins and its still operating technology are among the most commonly encountered artifacts in the Capital Wasteland. The Hubris Comics building contains evidence of the pre-war entertainment industry in the form of a printing facility and editorial offices for a comic book company. The comics themselves appear throughout the game as collectibles, and reading them provides in-game bonuses related to the specific themes of each title. The building that published them is explorable, containing the offices and studios where people worked on the art and writing before the bombs fell. Hubris Comics published a range of titles that included superhero comics, adventure stories, and satirical publications. The content of these comics reflects the pre-war cultural moment, the specific anxieties and aspirations and humor of a society that was approaching a catastrophe most of its members did not anticipate. The superheroes in the Hubris comics operated in a world that still had clear problems, still needed saving, but the scale of the saving was human-sized. No one in a Hubris comic imagined the kind of ending that actually came. The Oasis is a location in the northern part of the map where a unique occurrence has taken place. A ghoul named Harold has been slowly transforming over decades into something that defies standard categories. Trees have grown from his body. He has rooted himself, literally, into the ground. A small community of worshippers has formed around him, treating him as a sacred figure and caring for the grove that has grown from his changed form. Harold has been a recurring character in the Fallout series since the original games. His presence in Fallout 3 as an rooted, grove-growing figure represents the endpoint of a transformation that has been developing for decades of in-game time. The people who worship him have built their entire community around his existence, drawing meaning from the fact of his continued life and the unusual beauty of the grove he has inadvertently created. The player can speak with Harold. He is one of the wittier characters in the game, maintaining a sense of humor about his situation that is either deeply brave or deeply necessary, or both. He has opinions about what should happen to him, about the community that has formed around him, about the grove and what it means. Depending on the choices made during the associated quest, his situation can be resolved in several ways, each with different implications for both Harold and the community that has defined itself around him. The Nuka-Cola plant's roof contains a sniper position that most players never find. The building is a large interior space with multiple levels, and the exterior of the building has surfaces that can be navigated to reach elevated positions not accessible from the inside. The rooftop offers a view of the surrounding landscape from a perspective that most players never experience. It is one of many vantage points in the Capital Wasteland that reward players who explore three-dimensionally, who look up and around rather than simply moving through spaces at ground level. The Capital Wasteland rewards vertical exploration consistently. Megaton has elevated walkways. The ruins of Washington have buildings that can be entered and climbed. The geography of destruction has created elevated platforms and broken passages that make the third dimension meaningful in ways that a tidier landscape would not. Players who move only at street level experience a different Capital Wasteland from players who find the high points, the overlooked platforms, the stairs that still lead somewhere, even though the rest of the building around them has collapsed. The sewer systems beneath the Capital Wasteland form a hidden network of passages that connect various surface locations. They are inhabited by various enemies and contain loot, but their primary value to players who discover them is as a fast travel option through a dangerous surface landscape. Moving underground, navigating the tunnels that ran beneath the pre-war city, is one of the ways that the game uses the urban infrastructure of Washington, D.C. as a meaningful game space. The tunnels contain evidence of their pre-war function in the maintenance equipment and signage that survive. They also contain evidence of the various groups that have used them since the bombs fell, the desperate, and the strategic, and the lost. Some of the tunnels have been fortified by various factions. Others have been left in the condition they were in immediately after the war, dark and wet and maintained by no one, used by whatever crosses their threshold. Agatha is a violinist who lives alone in a farmhouse in the Capital Wasteland and broadcasts her music over a personal radio frequency. The quest associated with her involves finding a specific violin for her, retrieving it from a dangerous location so that she can continue playing. Her music, once she has the instrument she needs, can be heard on the Pip-Boy's radio throughout the rest of the game. Agatha is one of those characters who represents a kind of survival that is not about weapons or fortifications or political alignment. She has kept playing music. She has maintained her art in a world that has very little visible appreciation for it, in a landscape where getting through the day safely is the primary concern of most people. That she has a radio transmitter and broadcasts her playing suggests a desire to share it, to send the sound of pre-war trained musicianship out into the wasteland air for whoever might be listening. Her frequency sits on the dial alongside Three Dogs Station, another signal in the static. The cathedral in the game is not a religious building in the traditional sense, but rather a piece of location design that evokes similar architectural language in ruins form. The Capital Wasteland has several locations that use the visual vocabulary of pre-war civic and religious architecture in ways that are now separated from their original function. Arches and columns and elevated structures that once framed specific kinds of gatherings and meanings now frame enemies and loot and the business of survival. This is one of the subtler ways that Fallout 3 comments on civilization. The monuments and the memorials and the civic buildings of the old world were built to communicate specific things about the society that built them, about its values and its aspirations and its sense of its own importance. Those communications have not stopped. The buildings still say what they were built to say in their ruined states, but the audience has changed and the context has changed, and the meaning arrives differently when the buildings are ruins than it did when they were functioning. The final hours of the game, during the assault on the Jefferson Memorial and the resolution of Project Purity, are structured around a series of decisions. The player must navigate the Enclave's presence, must reach the control room, must face the choice of what to do when they get there. The choices available at the conclusion involve different trade-offs and different implications for the Capital Wasteland's future. None of them is presented as obviously correct. The water flows after the conclusion. The purification works. The aqua pura begins to move through the distribution systems that the Brotherhood of Steel will manage. What happens after that, what the clean water changes in the wasteland, what conflicts it creates, and what relief it provides, is beyond the scope of what the game shows. The ending presents the beginning of an aftermath. What the aftermath becomes is left to the imagination of anyone who has spent their time in the Capital Wasteland caring about the people who live there. The lone wanderer leaves Vault 101 in the opening hours, and the Capital Wasteland stretches out in every direction. The gray sky sits above the ruins. The river runs its irradiated course. Three Dog's voice reaches as far as his equipment allows. Somewhere in the north, a grove grows from an old man who has been carrying his own history in his changed body for longer than most people live. The herald of the oasis once traveled the wasteland. Long before the grove, long before the worship, long before the roots, he walked. He made decisions and carried consequences and moved through the world as something recognizable and mobile. The transformation happened over time, slowly enough that he could not point to the exact moment when walking stopped being possible and rooting began. He became something that the wasteland had no prior category for, and the people who found him built their category around him. His story contains the essence of what long survival means in the Fallout world. Enough time and enough change, and you become something your earlier self would not recognize. The herald who walked is still in there somewhere, still capable of wit and commentary and the particular weariness of someone who has seen more than they expected to see and is still seeing. The grove grew because he was still alive long enough for it to grow. Survival, in Harold's case, produced something genuinely new. The Enclave soldiers in the Capital Wasteland carry advanced power armor, the Enclave modified version that is more capable than the standard Brotherhood equipment available to the player through most of the game. Getting access to this equipment requires defeating the soldiers who wear it, a challenge that scales with the player's level and equipment. The T-51B power armor, considered the apex of pre-war power armor design, is available as one of the rarest and most sought items in the game. A piece of technology so well engineered that 2 centuries of nuclear aftermath have not produced anything that surpasses it. Power armor in Fallout 3 works differently from later games in the series. It can be worn without special training, requiring only that the player find a complete set and put it on. The Brotherhood of Steel treats the armor as a significant technological asset, maintaining and repairing it with the care that their doctrine requires. The Enclave treats it as standard issue equipment, which says something about the comparative resources of the two organizations and their different relationships to the pre-war military legacy they are both drawing from. The concept of karma in Fallout 3 is a simplified moral accounting system, a running score of the player's choices that affects how various characters and factions respond to the Lone Wanderer. It is not a subtle system. It rewards good actions and punishes bad ones in clear terms. But within its simplicity, it creates a particular experience of moral accounting that is unusual among games, the sense that choices accumulate and that the accumulation has observable consequences. The karma system also interacts with the game's ending in meaningful ways. The 3 possible endings, determined by whether the player has good, neutral, or evil karma at the conclusion, present different narrated visions of what the Lone Wanderer's legacy means to the Capital Wasteland. The good karma ending presents the player's sacrifice or accomplishment in heroic terms. The neutral ending is more ambiguous. The evil karma ending reframes the same actions through a darkly ironic lens. The same sequence of events means different things depending on what the player did in all the hours before that final moment. The Nuka-Cola Quartz and the Nuka-Cola Victory varieties are regional variants that appear only in specific areas of the game. Quartz was produced for the southwestern market. Victory was produced for southern states. Both varieties ended up in the Capital Wasteland through the normal routes of pre-war commerce, distributed by trucks and trains and the logistical machinery that kept consumer products moving across a country that was simultaneously preparing for a war that would make consumer products irrelevant. The regional marketing of Nuka-Cola variants is a detail that illuminates the scale of the pre-war Nuka-Cola Corporation. They were not simply producing a soft drink, they were managing regional preferences and targeted distribution and branded variety across a national market. The different designs and formulas for different regions represent an investment in understanding consumer behavior at a granular geographic level. All of that sophistication collapsed into irrelevance when the bombs fell, but the bottles remain, carrying their regional identities through a world that no longer has regions in the sense that the labels imply. The speech skill in Fallout 3 opens dialogue options that are not available at lower levels, allowing the player to talk their way through situations that would otherwise require combat or alternative approaches. This is one of the game's mechanisms for acknowledging that not everyone approaches problems the same way, that intelligence and social ability are forms of capability alongside combat skill and stealth. The persuasion checks in the game are presented as percentage chances rather than guaranteed outcomes, which means that attempting a speech option with insufficient skill still has a small probability of success. This introduces a gambling quality to social interaction, the possibility that the improbable will occur, that a character who should not be convincing will, through some combination of the right words and fortunate timing, convince the person they are speaking to of something surprising. These moments feel different from combat victories. They feel like luck, like getting away with something, like finding a way through that was not supposed to be there. The children in the game occupy a particular protected status. They cannot be harmed by the player through conventional means. This is a design decision that sits outside the fiction of the game, a choice made at the development level to ensure that the game would not be used to simulate harm to minors. Within the fiction, the children simply seem to move through the wasteland with an immunity that has no realistic explanation, surviving in environments that would be lethal to them, taking no apparent damage from encounters that would end a grown adult. The game does not draw attention to this. It is simply how things are. The presence of children in the Capital Wasteland, in Little Lamplight, and in communities like Rivet City and Megaton is itself a kind of optimism. The fact that children exist, that they are being born and surviving and growing up in the world after the bombs, means that the human species has not simply trended toward extinction. It has adapted. It is continuing. The children who play in the radioactive afternoon, or who run the bases at abandoned baseball fields, or who plan to become president someday, are proof that the apocalypse was not a conclusion, but a condition. The Vault Boy mascot appears throughout the game, on items and posters, and the Pip-Boy interface itself. His cheerful thumbs-up pose originated as a way to communicate good luck and positive outcomes within the context of the Vault program's training materials. The expression is optimistic in a way that is persistently incongruous with the situations in which it appears. The Vault Boy gives a thumbs up while demonstrating radiation burns and limb damage and other hazards. He is positive about everything, his smile never dimming, regardless of what the image behind the smile is actually showing. The character has become iconic in a way that far exceeds his original function. He represents Fallout itself, the particular combination of cheerful surface and dark underneath that defines the series' tone. The thumbs up in the ruins, the smile in the wasteland, The optimism of a mascot who was created to make terrible things seem manageable and who now exists as the emblem of a game about the ultimate failure of exactly that management. Broken Steel's continuation of the story introduced a new enemy type, the Enclave Hellfire Troops, soldiers wearing a new variant of Enclave power armor equipped with heavy incendiary weapons. Those soldiers represent the Enclave's final deployment of its most advanced military assets in a last attempt to hold power in the Capital Wasteland. They are among the most dangerous human enemies in the game, requiring significant preparation and resources to defeat. Their appearance in the extended story also shifts the tone of the post-main quest narrative. The main game ended with something that felt like resolution, with the purification complete and a sacrifice made. Broken Steel's continuation places the player back into conflict immediately, suggesting that resolution is always temporary, that the wasteland generates new problems even as old ones are solved. The clean water flowing from Project Purity is good. The Enclave's response to that good thing is to send better armed soldiers. The wasteland does not allow endings, it only allows transitions. The bobblehead statues scattered throughout the Capital Wasteland are among the most deliberately hidden collectibles in the game. There are 20 of them, each one representing a different SPECIAL attribute or skill, and each one placed in a location that requires either careful exploration or prior knowledge to find. They are small objects in large environments, easy to miss against the visual noise of ruin and debris that fills every room in the Capital Wasteland. Players who collect all 20 receive no formal ceremony or recognition from the game. The Pip-Boy updates. The stat bonuses accumulate, and the collection sits in the player's living quarters at Megaton or Tenpenny Tower, arranged on the shelf above the workbench, silent and cheerful and permanently thumbs up. The placement of each bobblehead was not random. The lockpick bobblehead is in Vault 92, the vault where musicians were driven to violence. The medicine bobblehead is in Vault 101 itself, available only during the opening sequence. The speech bobblehead is in Paradise Falls, the slaver settlement, which is either a commentary on something or simply a placement decision that happened to feel appropriate. The developers chose locations that rewarded a specific kind of engagement with the world, not the engagement of completing quests and following markers, but the engagement of opening every door, checking every shelf, looking at every surface with the question of what might be there. The science bobblehead sits inside Vault 106, the hallucinogenic gas vault, on a desk near the back of the facility. Reaching it requires navigating through the disturbed inhabitants of the vault, passing through the atmosphere that warped everything inside it, and finding a small desk in a large and disorienting building. The detail that the science bobblehead is in the vault where science did its worst work is not explained or underscored. It is simply there, waiting in the place where the application of scientific principles produced its most human consequences. Dogmeat is the dog companion available to the lone wanderer. He is found near the scrapyard north of Megaton, where he is either defending himself or waiting. Depending on how the player chooses to interpret the scene, he can be recruited without any speech check or special requirement, simply by approaching and being receptive to companionship. He will follow from that point forward, fighting beside the player, finding items on command, and being shot repeatedly by enemies in a way that becomes emotionally difficult over many hours of play. Dogmeat has no inventory. He carries nothing except himself and his willingness to be present. He cannot be given equipment. He cannot be instructed to wait indefinitely or to behave differently in different situations. He simply follows and fights and occasionally sits down in the middle of a dangerous location and looks at the player with the particular patient attention of a dog who is waiting to see what happens next. His presence changes the quality of the Capital Wasteland. The wasteland is less lonely with dog meat in it. That is the entire reason he exists as a character, and it is a sufficient reason. The Small Guns bobblehead is in the National Guard Depot, a multi-level facility that requires careful navigation of several interconnected buildings and a bunker below ground. The depot is one of the more architecturally complex locations in the game, a building that has been modified and repurposed in the years since the bombs, with evidence of multiple groups having used it for different purposes. The small gun skill is fundamental to most combat builds in the game, which makes its bobblehead one of the most sought, and the placement in a location that rewards thorough exploration is consistent with the game's philosophy about what diligent searching produces. The agility bobblehead is in the Greener Pastures disposal site, a radioactive dumping ground where barrels of nuclear waste were stored and have since leaked into the surrounding terrain. The location is modest and easy to pass by, a contaminated open area with a small office building beside it. The office holds the bobblehead on a desk in a room that smells, within the fiction of the game, of everything the site was built to contain. Picking up the agility bobblehead from that particular desk, in that particular location, feels like it should say something about what agility means in a world that produces places like this. It does not say anything. It simply increases the stat by 1 point. The VATS system, the Vault Tech Assisted Targeting System, is one of Fallout 3's most recognized mechanics. It allows the player to pause combat and designate attacks on specific body parts of enemies, with percentage hit chances calculated based on distance, weapon condition, and the target's position. The system slows the game's moment to something closer to deliberation, allowing players who might struggle with real-time gunplay to engage with combat on more forgiving terms. What is less commonly discussed is the fiction of VATS as a piece of technology rather than simply a gameplay mechanic. Within the world of the game, the Vault Tech Assisted Targeting System is a genuine technology built into the Pip-Boy as a combat assistance feature, designed for the population of Vault residents who would need to defend themselves in a post-nuclear environment. The system was developed before the war as part of the Vault program's preparation for what residents might face after leaving. Vault Tech anticipated that Vault residents would emerge into a dangerous world and would need technological assistance in surviving it. VATS was their answer to that anticipated need. The system's effectiveness in the game creates a particular rhythm to combat, an alternation between the chaotic real-time and the controlled slow motion of targeting mode. Players develop preferences for how they use it, some relying heavily on its percentage calculations, others using it only for finishing moves or headshots, others barely engaging with it at all. The option is always there, the option to pause and calculate rather than simply react. In a world of constant danger, the ability to pause and think is presented as a form of technology. The Nuka-Cola machine is one of the most ubiquitous objects in the Capital Wasteland. They stand in corners of buildings and along the walls of ruins, their glass fronts cracked or completely missing, their interiors empty or containing the last bottles that were never dispensed before the war ended the need for vending. Some of them still have power, their lights flickering in the dark of a building that has no other electricity, their mechanisms still ready to complete the transaction they were built for if a cap is inserted and a button is pressed. They are everywhere because they were everywhere before the war. The Nuka-Cola Corporation achieved a market saturation that meant its machines appeared in nearly every commercial and public space in pre-war America. Gas stations, office lobbies, school hallways, hospitals, train stations. The product was available at the point of need. After the war, those machines continued to occupy the spaces where they had been placed, functional or not, serving as one of the most persistent reminders that the consumer culture of the old world had been organized around the reliable availability of certain things, and that reliability had ended with everything else. The purified water item is one of the most valuable consumables in the game, healing hit points and removing a small amount of radiation in a world where radiation is the constant background condition of existence. Purified water is rare in the Capital Wasteland before the completion of Project Purity. Clean water requires filtration and processing that most wasteland communities cannot consistently perform. What the player's father was working to provide was not simply a commodity. It was one of the most fundamental resources that the post-war world lacked. The value placed on purified water by the game's economy reflects this scarcity. Merchants who carry it charge significant amounts for small quantities. Settlements that have access to water sources invest heavily in their security. The irradiated water of the Potomac flows everywhere, but it is dangerous to drink directly. The infrastructure to convert it to something safe requires exactly the kind of pre-war engineering knowledge and equipment that the Capital Wasteland does not have in abundance. James understood this. Project Purity was his life's answer to it. The mirelurks that inhabit the shores of the Potomac and various other bodies of water in the Capital Wasteland are among the game's more distinctive enemy designs. They are crustaceans that have been mutated far beyond their original size, moving with a crab-like sidestep and using their heavy shells as natural armor. Their claws are effective close-range weapons, and their shells resist most forms of standard ammunition, making them more resilient than their relatively slow movement suggests. The lore of the mirelurks places their origin in the crab and snapping turtle populations that once inhabited the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River system. Radiation from the bombs altered them over generations, increasing their size and aggression while retaining the basic biological structure of their pre-war ancestors. They nest in groups along shorelines and in underground areas near water. Their nests contain eggs that hatch into small and fast-moving juvenile mirelurks, enemies that are individually less dangerous than adults, but that appear in numbers and move in ways that adult mirelurks do not. The mirelurk queen is an encounter that appears in specific locations, a significantly larger and more dangerous variant that can spray acidic slime at range. Her presence in an area usually indicates a well-established nest and suggests that the mirelurk population in that location has been stable long enough for the largest individuals to reach their full size. Fighting a mirelurk queen at low levels is one of the more educational experiences the Capital Wasteland offers, in the sense that it teaches very quickly which kinds of fights should be avoided until better preparation is available. The Outcasts have a side quest called Operation Anchorage, but separate from the DLC, the Outcast-affiliated base at Fort Independence contains a repeating trade system that allows players to exchange pre-war technology for weapons and ammunition. The Outcasts will accept specific items that they are collecting for their cataloging mission, paying in goods that are useful for continued survival in the wasteland. The system rewards players who pick up technology items that other players might leave behind, finding value in objects that serve no obvious combat function. The contrast between what the Outcasts value and what the wasteland's general population values is instructive. Most people in the Capital Wasteland are concerned with food, water, caps, and weapons. The Outcasts are concerned with technology recovery, with documenting and preserving and understanding pre-war engineering. Their priorities place them in a specific relationship to the world's history, one that is less about survival in the present than about preserving the knowledge of the past for whatever purpose the Brotherhood's larger mission serves. Eulogy Jones, the leader of Paradise Falls, is one of the more vividly characterized antagonists in the game's secondary quest content. He runs the Slaver settlement with a combination of charisma and ruthlessness that has maintained his authority over a population that is, by definition, composed of people willing to do terrible things. He dresses well by wasteland standards. He speaks with a particular deliberateness that suggests someone who has thought about how to present himself and has decided that confidence communicates power more reliably than aggression. He is not the final boss of any quest. He is not dramatically confronted and defeated in a scene that the game gives special weight to. He can be killed in combat during the Liberation quest, or he can be bypassed. But his presence at Paradise Falls provides a face to the slaver economy that the game might otherwise have presented in more abstract terms. The slavers of the Capital Wasteland are not an anonymous mass. They have a leader who has made choices about what kind of person to be, and those choices are visible in how he carries himself in a place that exists because of suffering. The Shady Sands Shuffle is mentioned in the game's loading screen tips as a technique for disarming enemies, a move taught in certain historical contexts of the Fallout setting. The reference connects Fallout 3 back to the original game's West Coast setting, where Shady Sands was one of the founding communities of the new California Republic. The tip is one of many subtle connections between Fallout 3 and the earlier games in the series, references that reward players who know the history of the franchise and pass without comment past players who do not. These loading screen tips are one of the places where the game's writers had the most freedom to be playful and strange. The tips are informational, but they are also sometimes humorous, sometimes philosophical, sometimes slightly absurd in ways that fit the Fallout tone without being obtrusive. They are, by definition, easy to ignore. Players who are loading into a game they are eager to continue playing do not necessarily read the loading screen, but they are there, a layer of text sitting below the image of the Capital Wasteland, waiting for anyone who pauses long enough to notice. The special system, which governs character attributes in Fallout 3, was established in the original Fallout games and has remained the mechanical foundation of the series. Strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck each govern different aspects of the character's capabilities, with initial points distributed at character creation and modified by bobbleheads and equipment throughout the game. The system creates distinct character types that experience the wasteland differently, not just in combat, but in what they are able to perceive, what conversations they can access, how much they can carry, and what the game's random chance calculations favor. A character built around high intelligence gains more skill points per level, which over the course of the game produces a significantly wider range of competencies. A character with high luck finds that the game's random elements trend in their favor in ways that accumulate over time. A character with high charisma moves through the social landscape of the Capital Wasteland more fluidly, with more options available in conversations and fewer hostile responses from neutral-leaning characters. These are not dramatic differences moment to moment, but they produce meaningfully different experiences over hundreds of hours of play. The perception attribute governs how clearly the compass shows approaching enemies, how early threats are detected, and how precisely projectile weapons can be aimed. A character with very low perception moves through the Capital Wasteland with a persistent disadvantage, surprised more often, unable to see clearly at range, getting the full experience of what it would actually feel like to try to navigate a dangerous landscape with impaired senses. A character with very high perception knows where threats are before they are visible, can spot enemies through walls and around corners, exists in a world of information that is effectively invisible to less perceptive builds. The strength attribute affects carrying capacity in a direct and tangible way. Characters with low strength are constantly making decisions about what to take and what to leave behind. The Capital Wasteland is full of things worth carrying: weapons and armor and ammunition and food and medical supplies and items for crafting and collectibles and junk that might be worth something to a merchant. The limitation of carrying capacity turns inventory management into a real puzzle for low-strength characters, a series of constant choices about what is worth its weight. The luck attribute's effects are spread across nearly every system in the game, influencing the probability of critical hits, the outcomes of random events, the quality of items found in containers, and the behavior of certain NPC interactions. High luck produces a game where things tend to go well in the margins, where the random elements of a dangerous world seem to favor the player in subtle ways. It is one of the harder attributes to appreciate at low levels because its effects are distributed rather than concentrated, but players who build around it often describe a qualitatively different experience of the wasteland. The Megaton House is the first player home available in the game, obtained by either defusing the bomb at Megaton's center or by accepting a reward from a quest giver in Rivet City after completing certain tasks. The house can be upgraded with furniture and equipment purchased from Moira Brown's shop, including a workbench, a bed, a Nuka-Cola machine, and various decorative elements. The bobblehead display case holds the collection as it grows. A jukebox plays pre-war music if Agatha's quest has been completed. The house is small by pre-war standards. It sits against the wall of Megaton, wedged between other structures, accessible through a door that looks like every other door in the settlement. Inside, it is whatever the player chooses to make it. Some players furnish it completely, take care with the arrangement of their collectibles, make it feel like a home within the fiction of the game. Others use it purely as a storage location, piling items in crates and returning only when encumbered. The game supports both relationships to the space without comment or judgment. Shelter matters in the Capital Wasteland in ways that go beyond gameplay mechanics. Having a place to return to, even if it is a small room in a settlement built around an unexploded bomb, changes the quality of wandering the wasteland. The wandering is bounded. There is somewhere to go back to. The lone wanderer who steps out of the vault at the beginning of the game with nothing has, by the time they have a house with a bed and a bobblehead shelf, accumulated something that might be called a life. The Jericho Companion is a former raider who can be recruited in Megaton if the player has sufficiently bad karma. He has been in Megaton for years, paying off the consequences of his past, existing in a kind of enforced retirement from the violence that defined his earlier life. He is sardonic and self-aware about his own history in a way that makes him interesting despite his rough edges. He knows exactly what he is and has chosen to be something different within the limits of the choices available to him. Jericho's presence as a companion is one of the game's more unusual character options, a former villain who has elected to be something less bad and who will follow the player if their value alignment roughly matches his. His dialogue reflects someone who has made a kind of peace with his past without exactly forgiving himself for it, which is a more complicated emotional position than most companions in the game are written to occupy. He is not good. He is trying to be less bad. The Capital Wasteland has room for that. Karen is a ghoul companion, available through the Underworld Settlement, the community of ghouls living in the Museum of Natural History beneath the Great Hall. He is employed as a bodyguard through a contract that the player can purchase, which raises an interesting philosophical question about consent and employment in the wasteland that the game gestures at without fully exploring. Karen follows the contract's holder. When the player holds the contract, Karen follows the player. He is one of the more capable companions in the game, and one of the more reserved, speaking less than most, and carrying himself with the particular economy of movement that suggests someone who has been doing dangerous work for a very long time. His history, available through conversation, involves decades of service to a series of contract holders, not all of whom treated him well. He has outlasted them all in the way that people whose survival is a form of stubbornness tend to do. He does his job. He does not volunteer feelings about it. The underworld itself is one of the Capital Wasteland's more interesting communities. It occupies the Great Hall of the Museum of Natural History, living beneath the hanging whale skeleton and the dinosaur exhibits and the dioramas that were built to show the world before human civilization altered it. The ghouls of the underworld have built their settlement in a museum of natural history, which says something about their relationship to what they are and what the world they came from was. Carol and Greta run a hotel and inn within the underworld. They are ghouls who have been together for decades, a couple whose relationship long predates the existence of their current home. Their small business provides accommodation and a quiet place in an otherwise hostile landscape, and their presence gives the underworld a domestic quality that many settlements lack. They have opinions about the Capital Wasteland and about what it means to be a ghoul in a world that is not always hospitable to that condition, and they share those opinions with players who spend time talking to them. The Museum of Natural History's upper floors, above the underworld's community level, are occupied by feral ghouls. The transition from the organized settlement below to the abandoned exhibits above happens across a single staircase, the line between community and territory, between the ghouls who have maintained themselves and the ghouls who have not. The museum contains both at once, the living proof that the same condition can produce very different outcomes depending on circumstances the individuals involved did not entirely control. Hannibal Hamlin's escape route from the Temple of the Union leads toward the Lincoln Memorial, which requires the player's assistance to secure. The journey, if the player chooses to help, involves moving the escaped slaves through hostile territory to reach a destination that holds meaning for them. Completing the journey and securing the Lincoln Memorial for the freed slaves is one of the quieter positive outcomes available in the game. A small restoration of something symbolic in a world where symbolism has had to fight for survival the same way everything else has. The Lincoln Memorial, once the slaves have taken it back, becomes a functioning community space. The people who fought to reach it take up residence there. They work on the monument, maintaining it, treating it with a seriousness that the slavers who occupied it never brought. The physical memorial to Abraham Lincoln is still standing in the post-nuclear Capital Wasteland, and the people it means the most to have made it their home. The game does not make a speech about this. It simply shows it. The scrapyard is a location that players pass through early in the game on the way to recruiting dog meat. It is a utilitarian location, not dramatically designed or filled with obvious narrative content. It contains raiders, robots, and the accumulated machinery and vehicle remains that the name promises. But within its specific geography there are details worth noticing, the evidence of what the scrapyard was before the war and what it has become after, the different kinds of salvage that different groups have attempted to extract from it. Salvage is a fundamental economic activity in the Capital Wasteland. The Wasteland's material culture is built on what survives from the pre-war period, on the capacity to take something broken and extract from it something useful. The scrapyard is an extreme version of what the entire Capital Wasteland represents, a landscape of broken things that different groups are constantly trying to turn into functional ones. The raiders who work the scrapyard are doing what everyone else in the wasteland is doing, just with worse intentions about what to do with the results. The Protectron robots that appear in various ruins throughout the Capital Wasteland were built for specific jobs and have been executing those jobs, or attempting to, for 200 years. Police model Protectrons continue to patrol their assigned areas, responding to behavioral cues that were programmed long before the context of those cues became irrelevant. Maintenance Protectrons attempt to repair things that cannot be repaired, lacking both the parts and the complete understanding of systems that have evolved far past what their programming anticipated. Utility Protectrons move through their designated routes, as if the warehouses and facilities they were assigned to are still functioning, as if the pre-war economy that needed them is still running somewhere beyond the walls they patrol. The persistence of robotic programming in a world that has completely changed is one of the more melancholy recurring details in the game. These machines were built to serve a civilization that no longer exists, and they continue to serve it, or to attempt to, with the faithfulness of things that were never given the capacity to reconsider. A Protectron responding to the lone wanderer as a potential criminal in a pre-war facility is following the rules it was given in a world where those rules made sense. The rules have not changed, only everything else has. The Sentry Bots are the more aggressive counterpart to the Protectrons, military model robots built for combat that continue to execute their combat programming with the same faithless persistence. They are among the most dangerous mechanical enemies in the game, heavily armored and capable of sustained fire with multiple weapon systems. They are slow, which is the primary vulnerability the player can exploit, but their resilience makes them threats that require planning rather than simply reaction. The specific locations where Sentry Bots are deployed reflect their pre-war assignments: military installations, government facilities, secure areas that required armed robotic security. The Sentry Bots have not moved from those positions in 2 centuries. They are still guarding the things they were assigned to guard, which in many cases no longer exist or no longer need guarding. The weapon systems are still functional, the armor is still intact. The purpose has become irrelevant, but purpose is not a consideration the machines were built to evaluate. The Museum of American History contains exhibits about pre-war American civilization in the way that all museums of that type do, through the careful selection and arrangement of objects that are meant to represent something larger than themselves. In the post-war context, the museum's contents have become genuinely historical in a way they were not before, artifacts from a civilization that is now 2 centuries gone, rather than objects representing a living culture's view of its own past. The Hall of Presidents exhibit in the Museum of American History contains automated presidential models that continue to give speeches and presentations in the post-war period. The speeches were written for pre-war museum visitors and are now delivered to empty exhibit halls or to whatever wanderers happen to pass through. The automatons speak of American values and historical achievements to a world that experienced the ultimate failure of everything those speeches celebrate. They do not know this. They were not built to know it. They continue their presentations for an audience that is not there. The ricochet behavior of bullets in Fallout 3 is governed by the material properties of surfaces in a way that produces occasional unexpected outcomes. Bullets fired at metal surfaces at certain angles can ricochet in directions that damage or kill the shooter. This is not a frequently encountered mechanic, but it is a real one, and players who fight in confined metal-walled spaces occasionally discover it in the most direct possible way. The detail represents the kind of physics implementation that makes the world feel more real without being obviously advertised as a feature. The shish kebab weapon is one of Fallout 3's more memorable crafted weapons. It is a sword made from a motorcycle gas tank, kitchen knives, and pilot lights, producing a flaming blade weapon that is equal parts functional and absurd. It is one of the first unique crafted weapons the player can build if they have the right components and schematics, and it captures something essential about the Capital Wasteland's aesthetic, The way that functional tools are assembled from the broken pieces of different things, each component with its own prior life, combined now into something that would not have existed without the catastrophe that made it necessary. The weapon's construction is detailed in the schematic item, which includes a list of required components and a general description of how they are assembled. The schematic exists as a document within the fiction, a piece of practical knowledge that someone in the Capital Wasteland worked out and recorded and distributed. Unique crafted weapons in Fallout 3 each have schematics that can be found in multiple copies, with each additional copy improving the quality of the resulting weapon. The system treats practical knowledge as something that accumulates through repeated study rather than something mastered all at once. The rocket launcher is a weapon that uses junk items as ammunition. It fires teddy bears, tin cans, pre-war money, coffee mugs, and anything else the player loads into it at sufficient velocity to cause injury. The weapon is not the most powerful option available, but it is one of the most specifically Fallout weapons in the game, a device that converts the wasteland's inexhaustible supply of useless objects into something projectile. The world is full of things nobody needs. The rocket launcher gives all of them a purpose. There is something philosophically consistent about a weapon that treats everything as potentially functional with the right application of force. The Capital Wasteland operates on this principle broadly. Nothing is valueless. Everything has some potential application. The derelict buildings are shelter. The broken vehicles are cover in combat. The old magazines are sources of useful knowledge. The pre-war junk is ammunition if you have a rocket launcher and the right sense of pragmatism. The Chessmaster perk added in Broken Steel allows the player to place a chess piece on the board in Elder Lion's quarters in the Citadel, which modifies certain game calculations related to combat. The perk connects to a detail of the Citadel's environment that players who explore the Brotherhood's headquarters might notice: a chessboard set up in the Elder's office. That a chess game is in progress in the room where the Brotherhood of Steel's commanding officer works is either a deliberate character detail or a coincidental placement that acquired meaning after the perk was designed around it. Elder Lyons is one of the more complex faction leaders in Fallout 3. He has made decisions that isolated the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood from the main organization on the West Coast, prioritizing the protection of civilians over the accumulation of technology. His detractors, including the outcast Splinter Group, believe these choices represent a fundamental misunderstanding of the Brotherhood's purpose. His supporters believe they represent the Brotherhood's values applied correctly in a context the original founders could not have anticipated. Sarah Lyons, the Elder's daughter, commands an elite squad called the Lion's Pride. They are among the most capable Brotherhood fighters in the Capital Wasteland and operate as a strike team for the most demanding missions. Sarah herself is one of the characters the player interacts with most frequently during the latter portions of the main quest. Her relationship with her father's legacy and her own sense of what the Brotherhood should be give her a dimension that goes beyond simply being a capable soldier. She has thought about these things. She has opinions. She acts on them. The Lion's Pride has named members who appear and reappear throughout the quest content, making them feel like a real unit with history and relationships rather than an interchangeable military force. Each member has a personality that surfaces in their dialogue and their behavior during missions. They are not well-developed characters by the standards of the game's central figures, but they are individuated enough that the player comes to recognize them, and in some cases, to care when the missions they undertake do not end well for everyone involved. The radio signal coming from the Washington Monument before it is boosted by the player's repairs reaches only a short distance. Players who stay near the monument early in the game can hear Three Dogs broadcast cutting in and out as they move. After the relay antenna is fixed, the signal strengthens and the reception smooths out. The change is audible a practical demonstration of the quest's outcome that does not require any dialogue or cutscene. The world responds to the player's work in a form they can hear. Three Dogs' actual voice actor, Eric Todd Dellums, brought a specific energy to the character that distinguishes him from the game's other voice performances. Three Dog is enthusiastic, performative, deliberately larger than life in the way that radio personalities understand themselves to be. He is playing a role, the voice of the Capital Wasteland, and he knows he is playing it. The performance within the performance is part of who he is. He believes in what he does. The belief and the performance are not separate things for him. The music he plays connects to the emotional architecture of the Capital Wasteland in ways that are sometimes obvious and sometimes subtle. A particular song playing when the player crests a hill and sees the ruins of Washington laid out below carries a different weight than the same song playing in an underground tunnel. The music does not change based on location. It plays from the Pip-Boy regardless of context. But the Fallout series has always understood that pre-war music in post-nuclear environments creates meaning through contrast, that optimism surrounded by ruin resonates differently than optimism in comfortable circumstances. The Enclave radio station broadcasts Colonel Autumn's and President Eden's messages throughout the Capital Wasteland. These broadcasts serve as propaganda for the Enclave's claim to legitimate governmental authority, a claim that the game allows the player to evaluate based on their own assessment of the Enclave's actual behavior and stated intentions. The radio station's existence alongside Galaxy News Radio creates a dual broadcast environment where two very different narratives about the Capital Wasteland's present and future are competing for the same airwaves. The player can tune to either station from the Pip-Boy's radio function. They can listen to both. They can listen to neither. The choice of which narrative to hear, or whether to hear any narrative at all, is a small but consistent form of agency that the game provides throughout the entire experience. The Capital Wasteland is more or less the same, regardless of which radio station is playing. But the presence of the stations as options says something about how the game understands the relationship between narrative and the experience of living through a particular moment in history. The stim pack is one of the fundamental items of Fallout 3's economy. It is a medical device, a syringe-based treatment that heals physical damage rapidly, and it is the primary means by which the player manages their health in combat situations. Stim packs are available from medical vendors, found in health-related locations, dropped by enemies, and produced through certain crafting options. Their ubiquity makes them the basic unit of the game's medical economy, the item that stands between the player and the consequence of taking too much damage. The lore of the stim pack places its origin in pre-war pharmaceutical research, a military medical technology developed for battlefield use that was also made available to civilians through Vault Tech's distribution systems and commercial medical providers. The exact contents of a stim pack are not precisely described in the game, which is consistent with the general Fallout approach to technology, where the functional results are clearly established and the underlying mechanisms are left partially obscure. It works. That is the important thing about it. How it works is secondary to the fact that it does. Nuka-Cola itself, the flagship product of the Nuka-Cola Corporation, contains a small amount of radiation in its original formula. This was not a post-war mutation or an accidental contamination, but a deliberate ingredient, a proprietary compound called Nuka-Cola strontium that gave the drink its distinctive color and a slight radioactive signature. The compound was considered safe in the quantities used, and the Nuka-Cola Corporation maintained this position throughout the pre-war period, despite questions from regulatory bodies about the long-term implications of routine strontium consumption. The Nuka-Cola Corporation's confidence about the safety of its products is entirely in keeping with the pre-war world's approach to nuclear technology, which regarded radiation as a manageable aspect of modern life rather than an existential threat. Nuka-Cola capitalized on this attitude, leaning into the nuclear aesthetic with its branding and its products in ways that would be unthinkable in a world with different cultural assumptions about what nuclear means. The result is a product that is, in a very specific sense, perfectly suited to the world that produced it, and that somehow survived into the world that followed. The caps that function as currency in the Capital Wasteland are Nuka-Cola bottle caps. The decision to use bottle caps as a medium of exchange developed in the post-war period as scavengers and traders recognized that the caps were durable, finite in supply, and uniform enough to serve as a reliable unit of account. They cannot be counterfeited easily. They do not decay. They are light enough to carry in significant quantities. The fact that they were produced by a specific corporation for a specific consumer product is irrelevant to their current function, a detail of history that the economy has moved past. The value of caps is purely agreed upon, which is true of all currency in any system. The people of the Capital Wasteland have agreed that these small discs of metal are worth things. The agreement holds because enough people are participating in it, and because the alternative, a barter system requiring the matching of needs at every transaction, is less efficient. The caps worked when the alternative was worse than using them, and they have continued to work because the alternative has not improved enough to displace them. The radroaches encountered in the early sections of Vault 101 during the birthday party sequence that opens the game are among the weakest enemies in the entire game. They are small, they deal minimal damage, and they can be killed with a single hit from almost any weapon. They exist to introduce the player to the mechanics of combat in the safest possible context, within the familiar and relatively controlled environment of the vault, before those mechanics are tested in the Capital Wasteland's far more demanding conditions. But the radroaches are also one of the persistent background details of the post-war world. They appear in ruins and tunnels and basements throughout the game, occupying the lower levels of the food chain in post-nuclear ecosystems. They were cockroaches before the radiation changed them, and they have benefited more than most organisms from the conditions of the post-war world. They are common because they are adaptable. They are everywhere because they have found enough ways to survive in every environment the Capital Wasteland offers. Their weakness is the game's way of saying that survival does not require strength. It requires adaptability. The rad scorpion is a different proposition. Mutated from the scorpions of the American Southwest, rad scorpions in the Capital Wasteland have grown to significant size and retained both their venomous stingers and their natural armor plating in magnified form. They burrow underground and emerge near the player's location, making them difficult to detect until they are already close. Their poison causes ongoing damage that continues after the initial encounter, requiring the use of Radaway or waiting it out, which means that surviving a rad scorpion encounter can cost more than the immediate health loss from the fight itself. They are one of the Capital Wasteland's more effective enemies at creating dread before the encounter actually begins. Players who learn to recognize the signs of rad scorpion territory, the disturbed earth, the trails in sand, the characteristic sound of movement just below the surface, develop a heightened alertness when entering areas where they are likely to appear. The game uses that learned alertness to create tension in locations where rad scorpions might or might not be present. The possibility of the encounter is often as effective as the encounter itself. The Rock Creek Caverns are one of several cave systems accessible in the Capital Wasteland that exist as their own distinct environments, separate from the ruins and the settlements and the military installations that make up most of the game's explorable locations. Cave systems in Fallout 3 tend to be inhabited by creatures rather than factions, by Yao Guai or rad scorpions or super mutants who have used the caves as shelter, by the accumulated nesting materials and detritus of creatures who have been living in the dark for a long time. Rock Creek specifically has its own history visible in the evidence left by the various groups that have used it over the years. Pre-war human activity left its mark in certain areas. Post-war creature habitation has written over that mark in most places. The cave exists now as a natural space reclaimed from any human purpose, inhabited by things that were not changed by the war so much as the war's consequences changed the conditions for their expansion. The Yao Guai are mutated black bears. They are aggressive, fast, and capable of significant damage in close quarters. Their name comes from Chinese, reflecting a detail of the Fallout universe's pre-war political situation in which China was a primary adversary. The naming convention suggests either that the creatures were known to be associated with areas of Chinese military activity, or that the name was applied post-war by survivors who made a connection between the creatures and the conflict. The Yao Guai do not know they have a name. They are bears that have been made larger and more aggressive by 2 centuries of exposure to an altered environment. They do what bears do. Encountering a Yao Guai in the Capital Wasteland's forested areas, particularly in the regions around Vault 101 and to the north of Megaton, is one of the game's more abrupt surprises for early players who have been managing the relatively predictable threats of raiders and radroaches. The speed and aggression of a Yao Guai compared to the enemies that precede it in the normal progression of the game creates a genuine shift in the quality of danger, a reminder that the Capital Wasteland contains more than bandits and mutant insects. The Deathclaws encountered throughout the Capital Wasteland exist in a hierarchy that players can learn over many encounters. Basic Deathclaws are dangerous, but manageable. Young Deathclaws are slightly less dangerous, but faster. Alpha Deathclaws lead groups. Deathclaw mothers guard eggs. The hierarchy suggests a social structure, a family unit or pack arrangement that gives the creatures a degree of behavioral complexity not immediately apparent in the combat mechanics. They are not simply aggressive monsters, but animals with territories and relationships and a structure to their presence in any given area. The eggs found in Deathclaw nests can be taken. They can be cooked. They are a food item within the game's systems. Taking them from the nest will provoke any nearby adults, which is the game's way of noting that the eggs have a claim on them that the player is overriding. The ability to eat something that was being guarded by one of the game's most dangerous creatures says something about the particular relationship that Fallout establishes between danger and resource, between the cost of acquiring something and the value of the thing acquired. The Brahmin are the 2-headed cattle of the Fallout world, mutated from pre-war bovine stock by the same radiation that altered everything else. They are the primary large domesticated animal of the post-war period, used as pack animals, livestock, and in some cases as the foundation of the wasteland's modest agricultural economy. Their 2 heads are a physical reminder of their mutation, but they function as normal cattle in all other respects, eating whatever they can find, producing milk, being led from place to place by Brahmin herders who have built their livelihoods around managing them. The Brahmin in Fallout 3 appear at various settlements and in the care of traveling traders. Crow's Brahmin carries his merchant wagon. Trade routes in the Capital Wasteland are organized around the movement of Brahmin-pulled caravans between major settlements. The sight of Brahmin on the roads connecting the wasteland's communities is one of the game's persistent signs of civilization, of commerce, of the quiet persistence of human activity in an environment that is actively hostile to it. The Chrysalis Motors plant, referenced in Fallout 3's environment through the ruined vehicles that dot the Capital Wasteland's roads was one of pre-war America's major automotive manufacturers. Its cars run on nuclear fuel cells, a pre-war technology that had made gasoline obsolete in the Fallout timeline. These fuel cells continue to be functional long after the war, which is why the vehicles scattered across the wasteland can still explode if shot. The nuclear power source that made the cars long-lasting and efficient before the war makes the wrecks active hazards centuries afterward. The prevalence of nuclear fuel in pre-war technology is one of Fallout's most consistent design choices. The decision that the atomic age did not level off, but continued to expand into civilian life, that cars and household appliances and consumer goods all ran on nuclear power in ways that would have been unthinkable in our world's development. The result is a wasteland where even the most mundane piece of old infrastructure carries the potential for radiation, where the background condition of nuclear exposure is not just the result of the bombs, but of the entire technological system that preceded them. The GNR building, surrounded by super mutants, is cleared during the quest to repair the broadcast relay. What happens to that cleared space afterward is one of those game world questions that Fallout 3 does not fully answer. The super mutants who were eliminated do not respawn in the same numbers. The area near the GNR building becomes somewhat safer after the quest is completed, which is not stated but is observable. The quest changes the local ecology of the National Mall in a way that is not advertised, but that players who spend time in the area can notice. This kind of non-announced consequence is one of the ways the Capital Wasteland creates the impression of a world that responds to actions rather than simply resetting. Not everything resets. Some things change. Some changes are permanent. The player who cleared the super mutants from the GNR area changed something about the neighborhood's composition, and the neighborhood retains that change. It is a small thing. It does not matter to the overall story, but it contributes to the sense that the actions taken in the game world have weight. The Mirelurk cakes sold by some wasteland merchants are a prepared food item made from Mirelurk meat. The existence of a prepared Mirelurk food item suggests both that people hunt Mirelurks for their meat and that someone has figured out how to prepare that meat in a form appealing enough to sell. The culinary traditions of the Capital Wasteland are sparse and pragmatic, but they exist. People have learned to cook what is available. They have developed preferences and techniques. They have found ways to make something edible from the creatures that share their environment. Food in the Capital Wasteland is mostly contaminated with radiation, which means that eating heals some damage and causes some radiation exposure simultaneously. Managing nutrition and radiation exposure is a persistent, gentle tension throughout the game, a background condition of the post-war world that requires constant, small calculations. The cleanest food is the rarest. The most common food is the most contaminated. Survival requires accepting a certain level of radiation as the cost of maintaining energy for everything else. And so the facts accumulate, each one small, each one specific, each one a piece of the larger architecture that makes the Capital Wasteland feel inhabited rather than simply designed, lived in rather than constructed, real rather than rendered, the raider who runs the bases when no one is watching, the letter that told a family they were on a waiting list for survival, the pink armor in a folder where no one can wear it, the child who will never leave the cave, the bobblehead standing patient on a desk in a vault where the air was poisoned, the dog sitting in the rubble, waiting to see what happens next. These are the useless facts. They accumulate into something. They accumulate into a world worth spending time in, worth wandering through at night, worth listening to the quiet edges of, worth noticing even when there is nothing to be gained from noticing. The Capital Wasteland holds more than it shows. It holds all of the above and all the things no video could cover. The details discovered by a single player in a single session who never mentioned them, who found them and carried them and set them down again without knowing anyone else would ever look in the same corner. That is the nature of a world built with genuine care. There is always more. The care went deeper than anyone can fully document. The world extends past the edges of every map, into the dark corners of every building, into the file directories where the cut content waits unchanged, into the behavioral code of every NPC who continues their idle animation when the player walks away. The Capital Wasteland breathes all of that. It has been breathing it for a long time, and it is very good at being quiet about it. The final ruins of Washington, D.C. contain the remains of decisions made centuries before the bombs. The buildings that survived the war are the buildings that were built to survive stress, that were constructed with the institutional permanence in mind that governments use to communicate continuity and permanence. The monuments to the founding documents, the structures of the legislative and executive and judicial branches, the memorials to the wars and the leaders and the moments that the nation decided mattered, all of them are still standing in some form. They are standing in a world that the values they were built to communicate did not prevent. The monument says freedom. The Capitol said democracy. The White House, now a ruined shell occupied by enemies, said executive power and the continuity of the Republic. None of it was enough. The things those buildings said could not be heard over the noise of the war that ended everything, but they are still there. And on quiet nights, when the Capital Wasteland settles into the particular stillness that comes when the wind drops and the super mutants are somewhere else and the Pip-Boy's screen is the only light, those buildings are still visible, still recognizable, still saying what they were built to say to anyone standing in their shadow. The lone wanderer leaves Vault 101 and inherits all of that. The rubble and the ruins and the monuments and the small details and the useless facts and the quiet specific truths that are scattered through every room and every street and every terminal and every mailbox. There is an enormous amount to know about the Capital Wasteland. Most of it serves no purpose. None of it can be used to purify water or defeat an enemy or complete a quest. But knowing it makes the world more real. And a more real world is worth something. Even a ruined one. Especially a ruined one. The dust settles. The static hums. Three Dog's voice goes quiet between songs. And the Capital Wasteland breathes on. Steady and gray and full of small things worth knowing. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.